Königsberg, 1781. A 57-year-old bachelor professor sits in his study, holding a manuscript that will change everything. Immanuel Kant has just completed the Critique of Pure Reason, but his hands tremble slightly as he contemplates its publication. This methodical man, so routine in his habits that the townspeople of Königsberg set their clocks by his daily constitutional, has written something revolutionary. He knows it will destroy knowledge to make room for faith, as he puts it, but he's terrified the world isn't ready for such radical ideas. The irony is profound. Here stands a man who never ventured beyond 100 miles of his birthplace, yet he's about to revolutionize humanity's understanding of itself. Kant's external life embodies perfect predictability. The same breakfast, the same walk, the same evening routine, day after day for decades. His small stature, weak constitution, and rigid schedule seem to constrain rather than liberate. Yet within this fortress of routine, the most explosive intellectual revolution in modern philosophy has been quietly brewing. How does such external conformity produce such internal transformation? The answer lies in understanding that Kant's physical limitations didn't constrain his intellectual freedom. By eliminating the chaos of unpredictable experience, he created space for pure thought to operate. His mind became a laboratory where he could systematically dismantle and rebuild the entire structure of human knowledge. 3 questions haunted this methodical professor, driving his entire philosophical project. What can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope? These weren't abstract academic puzzles, but urgent personal inquiries, born from his lived experience of the Enlightenment's promises and contradictions. The Age of Reason had delivered unprecedented scientific knowledge, yet it seemed to undermine the very foundations of morality and religious faith. Individual freedom clashed with social order. Rational inquiry appeared to dissolve the certainties that made life meaningful. Answering these questions required nothing less than rebuilding philosophy from its foundations. Kant realized he needed to examine the most basic question of all. How is knowledge itself possible? This inquiry would lead him to his revolutionary Copernican turn. Instead of asking how our knowledge must conform to objects, he asked how objects must conform to the structures of our knowledge. This seemingly abstract shift transforms everything we think we know about ourselves and reality. The journey ahead reveals how this routine professor constructed a complete architecture of human reason, encompassing knowledge, morality, beauty, politics, and religion. His insights still shape our understanding of human dignity today. When we speak of autonomy, rights, and moral responsibility, we're using concepts that bear Kant's fingerprints. His philosophy offers something unprecedented, a systematic account of human reason that preserves both scientific knowledge and moral freedom, both individual dignity and social order. From the phenomena we experience to the freedom we possess, Kant maps the complete territory of human reason. His revolution continues to unfold, showing us not just what we can know, but what it means to be the kind of beings capable of asking such questions at all. Part 1. The Critical Turn, Awakening from Dogmatic Slumber. David Hume's devastating critique of causation awakened me from my dogmatic slumber. These words capture one of philosophy's most dramatic intellectual awakenings. Kant encountered Hume's treatise on human nature and realized that this Scottish skeptic had undermined the very foundation of all knowledge. Hume demonstrated that our most basic beliefs about cause and effect, that striking a match causes fire, that the sun will rise tomorrow, cannot be justified by experience alone. We never actually see causation. only succession. Consider Hume's famous example of billiard balls. We observe one ball move, then another, but never the causing itself. What we call causation is merely constant conjunction, one event following another, creating habits of expectation in our minds. This created an unprecedented crisis for Kant and for all of philosophy. If Hume is right, then science itself becomes impossible. Yet, science clearly works. Mathematics gives us certain knowledge. Physics reveals natural laws. Yet Hume's analysis suggests these are merely psychological habits with no rational foundation. The threat extended to the entire Enlightenment project, the belief that reason could unlock nature's secrets and guide human progress. Kant recognized that philosophy faced what he called a scandal. It could not even explain how the most basic knowledge is possible. The very discipline that claimed to examine the foundations of truth had no account of its own possibility. Both rationalists like Descartes and empiricists like Hume shared a fatal assumption that our knowledge must conform to objects. Descartes believed the mind receives innate ideas that mirror reality's structure, whilst Hume argued we passively receive sensory impressions from external objects. Both treated the mind as fundamentally passive, either discovering pre-given truths or recording external data. But Kant glimpsed a revolutionary possibility. What if this gets the relationship backwards? What if objects must conform to our knowledge, rather than knowledge conforming to objects? This reversal, seemingly simple, opens up an entirely new way of understanding the relationship between mind and world. The mind is not a passive mirror reflecting reality, nor a blank slate receiving impressions. It actively structures experience according to its own forms and categories. Just as we can know certain properties of all possible objects of geometry, because space itself is a form of our intuition, we can know certain features of all possible objects of experience, because they must conform to the mind's own organizing principles. This insight transformed philosophy's central question. Instead of asking, "What do we know?" Kant asked, "How is knowledge possible at all?" This shift from first-order questions about objects to second-order questions about the conditions of knowledge represents a new kind of philosophical investigation. Kant calls it transcendental, because it examines what must be true for experience to be possible in the first place. It requires investigating the mind's own structure and operations, the very architecture of human reason itself. Kant announced a revolution, as radical as Copernicus himself had achieved 2 centuries earlier. The Polish astronomer had solved the puzzle of planetary motion not by discovering new celestial mechanics, but by reversing our fundamental assumption about what moves. Instead of the sun and planets revolving around a stationary Earth, Copernicus proposed that Earth itself moves around a fixed sun. This simple reversal explained what had seemed impossibly complex. Kant saw philosophy trapped in exactly this kind of false assumption. Hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects, he wrote in the Critique of Pure Reason. But all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori, by means of concepts, have, on this assumption, ended in failure. The traditional view held that the mind passively receives impressions from objects, then somehow extracts universal truths from particular experiences. But this could never explain how we possess necessary knowledge about the world, knowledge that holds universally and could not be otherwise. Kant's Copernican revolution reverses this relationship entirely. Instead of our knowledge conforming to objects, objects conform to our knowledge. The mind does not passively mirror reality. It actively structures experience according to its own inherent forms and principles. Just as Copernicus made the observer move to explain celestial phenomena, Kant makes objects conform to the mind's structure to explain how knowledge is possible. This reversal immediately solves Hume's devastating problem of causation. Hume had shown that we never actually observe causal connections, only sequences of events. We see one billiard ball strike another, then see the second ball move. But we never perceive the causal necessity that supposedly connects these events. From this observation, Hume concluded that causation is merely a habit of expectation, not genuine knowledge. But if causation were merely psychological habit, science itself would collapse into mere opinion. Kant's revolution transforms this entire problem. Causation is not something we derive from experience by observing constant conjunctions. Rather, causation is a condition that makes coherent experience possible in the first place. The mind actively organizes the manifold of sensory impressions according to fundamental concepts, what Kant calls categories of understanding. These include causation, but also substance, unity, plurality, and others. Without these organizing principles operating a priori, we would confront what William James later called a blooming, buzzing confusion, rather than a world of distinct objects standing in intelligible relations. Consider what this means for the universality and necessity of causal knowledge. Causation holds universally not because we have observed it everywhere. Hume showed this impossible, but because it is built into the very structure of possible experience. Every coherent experience must be organized according to causal principles, because without such organization, there would be no experience at all, only chaotic sensation. The mind cannot help but structure its experience causally, just as it cannot help but experience objects in space and time. But this solution comes at a profound cost. If objects must conform to the mind's structure in order to be experienced, then we can never know things as they are independently of this structure. We know only phenomena, things as they appear to us, already shaped by our forms of intuition and categories of understanding. The things in themselves, the noumena, remain forever beyond our cognitive reach. This creates the famous transcendental distinction that will haunt all subsequent philosophy. The distinction between appearance and reality, between the world as we experience it and the world as it might be apart from our experience. Yet Kant sees this limitation as profoundly liberating. By showing the boundaries of theoretical knowledge, critical philosophy preserves space for practical reason, for morality, and for faith. Kant's philosophical revolution begins with a deceptively simple question. Given that something undeniably exists, mathematics, natural science, moral obligation, what must be true for this to be possible? This marks the birth of transcendental reasoning, a form of argument that sidesteps the traditional battle between rationalists and empiricists by asking neither what we can deduce from pure concepts nor what we can observe through experience, but rather what conditions must obtain for experience itself to be intelligible. The transcendental method represents neither pure empiricism nor pure rationalism, but something entirely new. Where Hume had shown that experience alone cannot justify our most basic beliefs about causation and necessity, and where rationalists, like Leibniz, had constructed elaborate systems that seem disconnected from actual experience, Kant discovers a third path. Transcendental arguments investigate the conditions that make experience possible, revealing structures that are neither arbitrary features of human psychology nor mysterious metaphysical truths about reality in itself. This approach allows Kant to be simultaneously humble and confident. humble because it acknowledges strict limits to what human reason can know, confident because within those limits it can establish truths that are both synthetic and a priori. We cannot know things as they are in themselves, independent of the conditions under which we must encounter them, but we can know with certainty what those conditions are and what they entail. The distinction between empirical and transcendental levels of analysis proves crucial. Empirical questions concern what we learn from particular experiences. That water boils at 100 degrees, that planets orbit the sun, that kindness generally produces gratitude. Transcendental questions probe deeper. What must be true for us to experience a world of objects with measurable properties, causal relationships, and moral significance? This is not psychology, but what Kant calls transcendental logic, investigation of those concepts and principles without which no coherent experience would be possible. Consider how this transforms our understanding of space and time. Empirically, we discover that objects exist in spatial relationships and temporal sequences. Transcendentally, we ask, what must space and time be for empirical investigation to be possible at all? Kant's startling conclusion is that space and time cannot be features of things in themselves, but must be forms of human sensibility, the conditions under which any discursive understanding, like ours, must receive its objects. This leads to Kant's transcendental idealism, which he carefully distinguishes from subjective idealism. These are not contingent facts about how individual minds happen to work, but universal structures governing any possible experience for beings constituted like us. When Kant argues that we cannot experience objects except under the conditions of space, time, and the categories of understanding, he means this applies to all rational beings who, like us, must receive rather than create their objects of knowledge. The universality of transcendental conditions separates Kant's position from Berkeley's subjective idealism, where objects exist only as ideas in individual minds, and from Hume's psychological skepticism, where our beliefs result from contingent habits of association. Transcendental idealism reveals necessary structures of any discursive understanding, one that depends on sensible intuition rather than intellectual intuition. This method transforms philosophy into reason's critical examination of its own nature and limits. Kant describes his project as reason putting itself on trial, investigating its own pretensions, whilst revealing its genuine capabilities. Part 2. The Architecture of Experience, Space, Time, and the Categories. Mathematics presents us with a profound puzzle that cuts to the heart of human knowledge. How can we know with absolute certainty that the angles of any triangle, whether drawn on paper, carved in stone, or existing only in thought, must sum to exactly 180 degrees? We haven't examined every triangle that exists or could exist, yet we possess this knowledge with a necessity that no amount of experience could establish. Traditional empiricism insists we learn from experience, but mathematical truths seem universal and necessary in ways that transcend any particular encounter with the world. Traditional rationalism appeals to innate ideas, but mathematical knowledge appears to tell us something genuinely substantive about reality, not merely about our concepts. Kant's solution to this puzzle revolutionized philosophy itself. Space and time, he argued, are not properties of things as they exist independently of us, but forms of human intuition, the necessary conditions under which we encounter any object whatsoever. When we perceive a triangle, we don't discover that it happens to exist in space. Rather, our very capacity to perceive anything at all involves spatializing it. Space isn't something we find in the world. It's the form through which we must encounter the world. As Kant declared with startling boldness, space is not something objective and real, nor a substance, nor an accident, nor a relation. Instead, it is subjective and ideal and originates from the mind's nature in stable fashion, as a scheme, as it were, for coordinating everything sensed externally. This insight transforms our understanding of mathematical certainty. Geometry doesn't describe objects in space. It describes the form of spatial intuition itself. Arithmetic doesn't count things in time. It explores the necessary structure of temporal succession. When we prove that triangular angles sum to 180 degrees, we're not discovering a fact about objects in space, but exploring the necessary structure of spatial intuition itself. Mathematical truths are both synthetic, telling us something substantive about the world we experience, and a priori, knowable independently of particular experiences, because they describe the forms through which we must encounter any possible object. This reveals the revolutionary heart of Kant's position. Space and time are empirically real, but transcendentally ideal. They govern all possible experience, empirically real, but are not features of things as they exist independently of our cognitive faculties, transcendentally ideal. This solves the puzzle of how we can have necessary knowledge about a contingent world. The necessity comes from the structure of experience itself, not from the objects experienced. Yet this solution raises a deeper question. If space and time are merely forms of intuition, what organizes the content that fills these forms? Raw sensation might be spatialized and temporalized, but how does it become organized into coherent objects? EC, tables, trees, persons. The forms of intuition provide the stage for experience. But something else must unite the manifold of sensation into the recognizable objects that populate our world. Even with space and time providing the basic framework for intuition, something profound remains unexplained. Raw sensations, however neatly arranged in spatial and temporal relations, would still present what William James memorably called a blooming, buzzing confusion. We don't simply receive disconnected patches of color, isolated sounds, or scattered tactile impressions. We experience houses, trees, people. We don't merely encounter temporal succession. We witness events, observe causes producing effects, recognize substances persisting through change. The question becomes urgent. How does consciousness transform the manifold of sensations into the coherent, structured world of objects we actually inhabit? Kant's answer revolutionizes our understanding of thought itself. The mind possesses 12 fundamental concepts, categories through which the understanding necessarily organizes all possible experience. These emerge not arbitrarily, but through systematic derivation from the logical forms of judgment. Consider quantity, unity, plurality, totality. When we judge the roses are blooming, we apply concepts of plurality and totality. Quality encompasses reality, negation, limitation. Every judgment involves affirming or denying properties. Relation includes the crucial concepts of substance-accident, cause-effect, and community. Modality covers possibility, existence, and necessity, the ways we determine what is actual versus merely conceivable. These categories represent the conceptual functions operative in every judgment. When we say the house is red, we apply substance, house, quality, red, and existence. But Kant's insight cuts deeper. These same conceptual functions organize sensory experience itself. The categories don't merely describe how we think about objects. They constitute the very conditions under which objects appear to consciousness at all. The transcendental deduction provides Kant's proof that categories must apply universally to experience. Without causation and substance, we couldn't experience a coherent objective world. Without unity and plurality, we couldn't organize sensations into discrete objects. Without possibility and necessity, we couldn't distinguish between what is actual and what is merely imagined. The categories aren't features of things in themselves, but the conceptual structure through which any discursive understanding must organize its experience. This yields a startling conclusion. We achieve objective knowledge precisely because objects conform to the mind's organizing principles, rather than the mind passively receiving ready-made objects. The objectivity of experience, any one, the fact that we all encounter the same world of causally related substances, results from universal application of identical categories by all rational beings constituted like us. Objectivity isn't mind independence, but universal validity arising from shared rational structure. Yet this explanation raises the deepest question of all. What unifies this organizing activity itself? What ensures that all these categories belong to a single consciousness rather than fragmenting into disconnected conceptual operations? Kant calls it the highest point of his entire critical system, the transcendental unity of apperception, that mysterious I think, which must be able to accompany all our representations. This isn't the empirical self we encounter through introspection. Our particular memories, desires, the psychological personality we discover when we turn inward. Rather, it's the formal condition that makes unified consciousness possible at all. Without this transcendental ego, we would possess merely a stream of disconnected mental states, a chaos of sensations and thoughts, with no single consciousness to bind them together. As Kant puts it, the I think must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all. The profound insight emerges when we recognize that personal identity and objective experience arise through the very same synthetic activity. The same unification that creates a single, continuous consciousness simultaneously creates unified objects within a coherent world. When I recognize that my current perception of a house connects to my memory of seeing it yesterday, I'm performing precisely the same kind of synthesis that allows me to recognize the house itself as a single, persisting object, rather than a series of disconnected appearances. The unity of consciousness and the unity of objects prove to be two sides of the same coin, both products of the understanding's synthetic activity, working through the pure concepts we've examined. Here, we must grasp a crucial distinction that dissolves centuries of philosophical confusion. The transcendental ego differs fundamentally from the empirical ego we know through introspection. The transcendental ego isn't a thing or substance, but a function, the activity of synthesis that makes experience possible. We can never know this ego as an object, because it constitutes the very condition for knowing any object whatsoever. This insight dissolves traditional problems about personal identity. The question isn't what makes the self a persisting substance, but rather what makes unified experience possible for any consciousness structured like ours. This transcendental unity reveals how subjective mental states can yield genuinely objective knowledge. Objectivity doesn't require mind independence, but rather the universal validity that results from the necessary conditions of any possible unified consciousness. When we make objective judgments, the house is red, fire causes smoke. We're not describing mind-independent reality, but making claims that any rational being must accept. given the shared structure of possible experience. The objectivity of our knowledge derives not from correspondence to things beyond experience, but from the universal necessity built into the very conditions of unified consciousness. Yet this solution comes with a price that will haunt the remainder of Kant's system. If we can only know objects as they appear to consciousness structured by space, time, and the categories, what about things as they might exist in themselves, beyond the conditions of possible experience? Part 3. The Limits of Knowledge, Phenomena, Noumena, and the Antinomies. Kant's Copernican revolution comes at a price that transforms the very nature of human knowledge and its relationship to reality. If we can achieve objective knowledge only because objects conform to the mind's structure rather than the mind passively receiving objects as they are, then we face an immediate and troubling consequence. We can never know things as they exist independently of this cognitive structure. This is not merely a limitation, but a fundamental redefinition of what knowledge means and what reality we can legitimately claim to encounter. The distinction Kant draws between phenomena and noumena captures this transformation with stark precision. Phenomena are objects as they appear to us, necessarily structured by the pure forms of intuition, space, and time, and organized through the categories of understanding. These appearances are not illusions or mere mental constructs. They constitute the only objects we can ever know, and our knowledge of them can be genuinely objective precisely because they conform to universal conditions of possible experience. Noumena, by contrast, are the concept of objects, as they might exist independently of these forms of cognition. Things in themselves, beyond the reach of sensible intuition and conceptual determination. This distinction simultaneously solves traditional metaphysical problems and creates new difficulties that will haunt philosophy long after Kant. On one hand, it explains how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible, whilst preserving the objectivity of empirical knowledge. On the other hand, it seems to make the ultimate nature of reality forever unknowable, trapping us within the boundaries of our own cognitive apparatus. Yet Kant insists we must think noumena, even though we cannot know them. Without this concept, we would be committed to an absurd idealism that makes our knowledge absolute, the notion that things exist only insofar as they appear to consciousness. The concept of noumena serves as what Kant calls a limiting concept, reminding us of the boundaries of our knowledge, whilst preventing us from transforming these boundaries into positive claims about reality. We must think of things in themselves to avoid making appearances into things in themselves, but we cannot know what we are thereby thinking. This creates a peculiar philosophical situation. Reason requires a concept it cannot fill with content, a necessary thought that remains forever empty. The phenomena, noumena distinction, transforms traditional metaphysical questions in ways that reach far beyond epistemology. Instead of asking, "What is the nature of reality?" we must ask, "What can we legitimately claim to know about reality, given the conditions under which knowledge is possible for beings like us?" This doesn't eliminate metaphysics, but transforms it from dogmatic speculation into critical investigation of reason's own limits and pretensions. Traditional problems, NCS, the nature of substance, causation, the soul's immortality, are diagnosed as arising from illegitimate extensions of concepts beyond their proper domain of possible experience. This transformation creates a profound tension that will drive much of subsequent philosophy. The distinction seems necessary to avoid dogmatic idealism and preserve the possibility of things existing independently of our knowledge. Yet, it appears to make the external world unknowable and potentially irrelevant to our cognitive lives. How can we maintain meaningful contact with reality if that reality is forever beyond our cognitive reach? How can we avoid the suspicion that the noumenal world is merely a philosophical fiction, a conceptual placeholder for our ignorance? Kant's answer points toward the positive role the noumenal realm will play in his practical philosophy. If we cannot know ourselves as noumenal beings through theoretical reason, perhaps we encounter ourselves as such through moral experience. The very limitation of theoretical knowledge opens space for practical reason to reveal aspects of our existence that transcend the phenomenal world. Reason possesses an extraordinary drive, an almost compulsive need to push beyond every boundary, to find the complete story behind every partial explanation. When we encounter any conditioned thing, any event or object that depends on something else, reason immediately demands its conditions. Find the cause of an event, and reason asks for the cause of that cause. Discover what makes something possible, and reason seeks what makes those conditions possible in turn. This restless movement toward totality, toward the unconditioned ground of everything conditioned, defines reason's essential character. It's what makes us rational beings, rather than merely understanding ones. We're never satisfied with fragments, but always seek systematic completeness. Yet, when reason applies this natural drive to the world as a whole, something remarkable and troubling occurs. Rather than achieving the systematic unity it seeks, reason encounters systematic contradiction. It finds itself defending opposing claims with equal rigor, each supported by apparently sound arguments. These are the antinomies, literally, conflicts of laws, where reason's own principles lead it into self-contradiction. Consider the first antinomy, concerning the world's temporal beginning. Reason can prove with perfect logical rigor that the world must have had a beginning in time. If the world had no beginning, then an infinite series of successive states would have elapsed before any given moment. But an infinite series cannot be completed through successive synthesis, so the world must have begun. Yet reason can prove with equal rigor that the world cannot have had a beginning. If the world began, it began in empty time. But empty time provides no distinguishing condition for beginning rather than not beginning, so no beginning is possible. The same pattern emerges across all four antinomies. The world must be composed of simple, indivisible parts. Otherwise, composite things would remain composite, even when we remove all composition, which is contradictory. Yet the world cannot be composed of simple parts. The space and time are infinitely divisible, so everything in them must be infinitely divisible too. There must be causation through freedom. Otherwise, the series of natural causes would lack the unconditioned ground that reason demands. Yet, there can be no causation through freedom. Every event follows necessarily from antecedent conditions according to natural laws. There must exist a necessary being as the unconditioned ground of all contingent existence. Yet, no necessary being can exist. Everything we encounter is contingent, and necessity cannot be derived from contingency. Each antinomy presents thesis and antithesis, both supported by rigorous proof, both apparently contradicting the other. This isn't a failure of logic or a problem with particular arguments. 17. It reveals something profound about reason's structure when it overreaches its proper bounds. The deeper problem becomes clear when we examine what these antinomies actually attempt. They treat the world as if it were an object that could be given in possible experience, but the world as a totality transcends any possible experience. We can experience events within the world, objects in space and time, causal connections between phenomena, but we can never experience the world itself as a complete object. When we ask whether the world has a beginning, we're applying categories of understanding beyond their legitimate domain, treating noumena as if they were phenomena. This reveals the antinomies as products of transcendental illusion, enkos, the systematic mistake of treating regulative principles as constitutive ones. Reason's drive toward totality properly functions as a regulative principle, a rule for extending inquiry ever further. It tells us to keep seeking conditions, to push our investigations toward greater systematicity and completeness. But when we mistake this regulative principle for a constitutive one, dissipor, when we treat it as making claims about objects rather than guiding inquiry, we generate the antinomies. The resolution demonstrates critical philosophy's power. Traditional metaphysics promised knowledge of ultimate reality, and here, God, the soul, the world as a totality. For centuries, philosophers constructed elaborate proofs, claiming to demonstrate these truths through pure reason alone. Kant's critical philosophy reveals why these attempts inevitably fail, not through better arguments within the same framework, but by exposing the fundamental error underlying the entire enterprise. The ontological argument for God's existence exemplifies this transcendental illusion. Whether in Anselm's medieval formulation or Descartes' rationalist version, the argument treats existence as a predicate that can be added to a concept. Define God as the most perfect being, the argument runs, and existence must belong to this concept, since a non-existent perfect being would be less perfect than an existing one. Kant demonstrates that existence is not a real predicate at all. It adds nothing to the concept of a thing. 100 real thalers do not contain the least coin more than 100 possible thalers, he observes. The concept remains identical, whether we're thinking of possible or actual thalers. Existence concerns the relation between concepts and objects, not the internal content of concepts themselves. The cosmological argument fares no better under critical scrutiny. This proof attempts to infer God's existence from the contingency of worldly things, reasoning that everything contingent requires a necessary cause, ultimately leading to a necessary being. But this argument smuggles in the ontological argument's central error, whilst adding a new mistake. It illegitimately extends the principle of causation beyond possible experience. Causation applies only within the phenomenal realm, where we encounter objects in space and time. To project causal reasoning beyond this domain, to infer a transcendent cause from empirical contingency, violates the critical limitation of concepts to their proper sphere of application. The physico-theological argument, drawing on apparent design in nature, might seem more promising since it begins with empirical observation. Yet even if we grant its inference from natural order to an intelligent cause, this argument cannot establish the God of traditional theism. At most, it could prove a finite designer proportioned to the effects we observe, an architect of natural systems, not an infinite, perfect, necessary being. To bridge this gap, the argument must again invoke the ontological proof, inheriting all its difficulties. These failures share a common structure. They attempt to extend concepts beyond their legitimate domain, the realm of possible experience, and thus fall victim to transcendental illusion. They mistake the subjective necessity of certain concepts for objective knowledge of corresponding realities. Rational psychology commits a parallel error in its claims about the soul. Traditional arguments purport to establish the soul as simple, permanent, personal, and substantial. These conclusions result from mistaking the formal conditions of thought for knowledge of a thinking substance. The I think that must be able to accompany all my representations is indeed a necessary feature of consciousness, the transcendental unity of apperception that makes unified experience possible. But this formal condition tells us nothing about the nature of the thinking subject as an object. The paralogisms of rational psychology treat this transcendental I as if it were empirical knowledge of a metaphysical entity. Because the I cannot be decomposed into parts, rational psychology concludes the soul is simple. Because it persists through all changes of content, the soul must be permanent. Because it unifies diverse representations, it must be a substantial unity. Each inference commits the same fallacy, confusing the logical conditions that make thought possible with knowledge of what thinks. Rational cosmology generates its own distinctive problems through the antinomies of pure reason. Here, reason necessarily produces contradictory conclusions about the world as a totality. Is the world finite or infinite in space and time? Part 4. The Fact of Reason, the Discovery of Moral Law. Kant's philosophical journey takes a remarkable turn as we move from theoretical to practical philosophy. While the critique of pure reason required hundreds of pages to establish the validity and limits of human knowledge, moral consciousness presents itself with immediate certainty. We don't need elaborate arguments to prove that moral obligations exist. They see. We experience them directly in the commanding voice of conscience. This isn't theoretical knowledge requiring justification. It's what Kant calls a fact of reason, as undeniable as our own existence. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and steadily we reflect upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. These famous words capture something profound about moral experience. The starry heavens represent the sublime order of nature, governed by causal necessity. But the moral law within reveals a different kind of order. See, one that we participate in creating through our choices. This moral consciousness doesn't come from observation of the external world, but springs from our nature as rational beings capable of self-legislation. The moral law manifests as what Kant terms the categorical imperative, ABN, a principle that commands unconditionally, not based on our desires, the consequences we seek, or any external authority. Unlike hypothetical imperatives that tell us what to do if we want certain outcomes, moral obligation commands categorically, not if you want to be trusted, tell the truth, but simply tell the truth. This unconditional character distinguishes genuinely moral commands from merely prudential or instrumental advice. The categorical imperative represents a synthetic, a priori principle of practical reason. It's synthetic because it tells us something substantive about how we ought to act. It's not merely a logical truth or definition. It's a priori because its validity doesn't depend on particular circumstances, cultural practices, or empirical facts about human psychology. The moral law applies to any rational being as such, not just to creatures with our specific evolutionary history or social arrangements. This independence from experience proves crucial to understanding moral obligations' unique character. Empirical principles can only yield hypothetical imperatives based on contingent desires or observed consequences. But moral obligation claims universal and necessary validity that transcends particular circumstances. If moral law were derived from human nature, it would apply only to beings sharing that nature. If based on consequences, it would remain conditional on achieving those outcomes. If grounded in divine command, it would represent heteronomy rather than the autonomy that moral responsibility requires. The moral law must therefore be a principle of pure practical reason, far valid for rational beings, regardless of their empirical characteristics, desires, or circumstances. This reveals a profound reciprocal relationship between moral law and freedom that is less than #0, 5 hashes greater than. The moral law serves as the ratio cognoscendi of freedom, enchi, how we discover our capacity for autonomous action. The very fact that we experience moral obligation reveals that we're not merely natural beings determined by causal forces. We possess the remarkable capacity to act on principles we give ourselves. Yet freedom simultaneously serves as the ratio essendi of the moral law. CO. The condition that makes moral obligation possible in the first place. Without genuine freedom to choose between alternatives, moral commands would be meaningless. The ought implies can. Moral responsibility presupposes the capacity for autonomous action that transcends natural determination. This discovery transforms our understanding of human nature and dignity. Through moral consciousness, we recognize ourselves as citizens of two worlds, the sensible world of natural causation and the intelligible world of moral freedom. The moral law within connects us to this higher realm of rational autonomy, revealing capacities that elevate us beyond mere natural existence, whilst imposing the awesome responsibility of self-legislation. Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative emerges from a striking recognition. We already engage in moral reasoning by testing whether our proposed actions could become universal principles. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This isn't Kant imposing an external constraint on moral thinking, but revealing the internal logic already present in genuine moral deliberation. When we contemplate lying to escape a difficult situation, something in us naturally asks, what if everyone did this? This universalization test operates spontaneously in moral consciousness, revealing whether we're treating moral law as genuinely universal or crafting convenient exceptions for ourselves. The categorical imperative formalizes this process, showing that moral reasoning demands we test our maxims against the criterion of universal legislation. Kant demonstrates this through carefully chosen examples that reveal different ways the universalization test can fail. Consider the lying promise. Someone needs money and contemplates promising to repay it, whilst knowing they cannot. The maxim, make false promises when in need, fails the universalization test because we cannot consistently will a world where everyone makes false promises. The very institution of promising would collapse, promises would become meaningless, and the intended effect of our lie would be impossible. This reveals a contradiction in conception. The maxim defeats its own purpose when universalized. The suicide example operates differently. Someone contemplating ending their life from self-love asks whether they could will universal suicide from self-love. Here we can conceive such a world, but we cannot consistently will it, because the same feeling that promotes life would systematically destroy it. This represents a contradiction in will, rather than conception. We can imagine the scenario but cannot rationally endorse it as a universal principle. Kant's example of refusing to develop one's talents reveals another dimension. We might contemplate a maxim of pure leisure, developing no capacities beyond immediate pleasure. But we cannot will this universally because rational beings necessarily value the development of human capacities, SEA. To will their systematic neglect contradicts our nature as beings who find meaning through the exercise of our powers. The beneficence example completes the picture. Someone might adopt the maxim, "Help no one in distress," and imagine a world where everyone follows this principle. We can conceive such a world, but we cannot consistently will it, because rational beings necessarily face situations requiring assistance from others. To will universal non-beneficence would be to will our own abandonment in times of need. This distinction between contradictions in conception and contradictions in will explains why some duties are perfect, whilst others are imperfect. Perfect duties like truth-telling admit no exceptions because their violation creates logical contradictions when universalized. Imperfect duties like beneficence require judgment about when and how to fulfill them because they involve contradictions in willing rather than pure logical impossibility. The universalization test captures something profound about moral reasoning. It demands we treat moral principles as genuinely universal, rather than creating special exceptions based on self-interest or circumstance. The categorical imperative doesn't provide specific rules for every situation, but offers a procedure for testing whether our proposed actions conform to practical reason's demands. This universalizability requirement points toward a deeper recognition that will emerge in the second formulation. If moral law must be universal, it must respect something universal in all rational beings, their equal dignity as autonomous moral agents capable of legislating universal principles. The first formulation of the categorical imperative demands that we act only on maxims we could will as universal laws. But this raises an immediate question. Why should universalizability matter at all? What makes the capacity for universal legislation morally significant? Kant's second formulation provides the answer by making explicit what was implicit in the first, the absolute worth of rational nature itself. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This formulation reveals the foundation beneath moral obligation, AI. Not arbitrary rules or divine commands, but the distinctive dignity of rational beings. The reason we must universalize our maxims is that all rational beings possess equal worth as moral agents, each capable of the same legislative function we exercise when we test our principles against universal law. What makes rational nature distinctively valuable? Everything else in the natural world derives its value from our purposes and desires. Food has value because it satisfies hunger. Tools have value because they accomplish our goals. Even beautiful objects have value because they please us. But rational beings alone have the capacity to set their own purposes through moral reasoning rather than being determined by natural impulses or external forces. This capacity for autonomous moral choice, the ability to act on principles we give ourselves, is what elevates persons above all price. Kant captures this distinction precisely. In the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. What has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. What, on the other hand, is raised above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent, has a dignity. Unlike commodities that can be exchanged or replaced, rational beings possess irreplaceable worth because they alone can participate in moral legislation. This dignity creates specific obligations about how we may and may not treat one another. To treat someone merely as a means involves using them in ways that bypass or undermine their capacity for rational choice, to deception that prevents informed consent, coercion that overrides their will, or manipulation that exploits their vulnerabilities. Such treatment denies their status as moral agents capable of autonomous decision-making. Treating someone as an end in themselves means respecting their capacity for rational agency even when we disagree with their choices or find their decisions inconvenient. This doesn't prohibit all instrumental relationships. We use the baker as a means to obtain bread, the teacher as a means to gain knowledge, but these relationships must remain compatible with respect for the other person's rational autonomy. The baker freely chooses to sell bread. The teacher voluntarily accepts the role of educator. The connection between universal law and respect for persons reveals itself as two aspects of the same moral principle. When we universalize our maxims, we implicitly treat all rational beings as equally capable of moral legislation. SEM. We ask whether everyone could adopt this principle, thereby recognizing others as fellow moral agents. When we treat people as ends in themselves, we acknowledge their capacity to participate in the same universal law-giving that grounds our own moral authority. This convergence points towards something even more profound. If all rational beings share the capacity for moral legislation, and if this capacity grounds their absolute worth, then morality itself emerges as a collaborative enterprise. We are not isolated individuals following private principles, but co-legislators in a community governed by laws we give ourselves through reason. Part 5. The autonomy of the will, freedom, and moral self-legislation. Freedom presents itself to us in two fundamentally different forms, and understanding this distinction unlocks the deepest mystery of human moral experience. Negative freedom appears first, the capacity to resist the immediate pull of desires, emotions, and external pressures. When you pause before acting on anger, when you resist the temptation of immediate pleasure for longer-term considerations, when you refuse to be swept along by crowd sentiment, you exercise negative freedom. This is independence from determination by sensible impulses, the ability to step back from the natural flow of cause and effect that governs the phenomenal world. But negative freedom alone cannot ground genuine morality. A person who acts randomly or arbitrarily possesses negative freedom, yet remains morally worthless. The capacity to resist natural impulses creates space for moral action without determining what should fill that space. This is where positive freedom emerges, not merely independence from external determination, but the capacity for self-legislation according to principles we give ourselves as rational beings. Positive freedom is autonomy in its literal sense, self-law giving. Kant recognized that most of what passes for morality actually represents heteronomy, being governed by external authority, even when that authority appears benevolent. If you act morally because God commands it, because society expects it, or because it promotes happiness, you remain an instrument of external purposes rather than a genuine moral agent. Even acting from natural sympathy or benevolent inclination lacks moral worth precisely because it's heteronomous, determined by something other than your own rational will. The moral worth of an action depends entirely on its arising from your own recognition of moral law, not from external compulsion or inducement. This generates the central paradox of moral autonomy. We are most free when we act under the constraint of moral law, and most enslaved when we follow our immediate desires. This seems to reverse common sense. Every T. How can constraint represent freedom? Kant's revolutionary answer transforms our understanding of both concepts. When you act morally, you act on principles. You give yourself as a rational being. When you act on desire, you are determined by forces external to your rational will. The moral law isn't imposed from outside, but expresses your own rational nature. You are free when you act as a rational agent, unfree when natural impulses push you around like a leaf in the wind. Autonomy becomes the ground of human dignity itself. You are subject only to laws you legislate for yourself as a rational being. This makes you neither a god, who would need no moral law, nor a beast, who is incapable of moral law, but something unique, a finite rational being capable of moral self-determination. Your dignity doesn't derive from natural capacities, achievements, or even virtue, but from the capacity for moral autonomy itself. This capacity makes you an end in yourself, rather than merely a means to external purposes, establishing the foundation for a community of autonomous moral agents who recognize each other's fundamental dignity. Act as if you were, through your maxims, a legislating member in a universal kingdom of ends. With this third formulation of the categorical imperative, Kant unveils his most ambitious vision of moral life, not merely as individual duty or respect for persons, but as participation in an ideal moral community. The kingdom of ends represents a systematic union of rational beings under common objective laws, where every member serves simultaneously as sovereign and subject. Here, individual freedom and universal law achieve perfect harmony through collective moral legislation. This formulation brilliantly unites Kant's previous two. We legislate universal laws as the first formulation demands, whilst treating all rational beings as co-legislators rather than mere subjects, as the second formulation requires. In the kingdom of ends, there are no purely private moral judgments. Every moral principle must be one that all rational beings could accept as members of a shared moral community. This doesn't eliminate individual moral responsibility, but places it within a framework of collective rational legislation, where each person's autonomy becomes compatible with everyone else's. What does membership in this kingdom actually involve? Every rational being possesses dignity, APH, absolute worth that cannot be traded off against other goods, and the fundamental right to participate in moral legislation. No one can be excluded from the community of moral agents simply because of their circumstances, abilities, or social position. This creates profound obligations. We must respect others' dignity whilst actively promoting the conditions under which moral autonomy can flourish for all. The kingdom of ends thus generates duties both negative and positive. We must refrain from treating others as mere instruments, but we must also work to create institutions, practices, and forms of education that enable everyone to develop and exercise their capacity for moral reasoning. A society that denies education, perpetuates poverty, or systematically excludes groups from participation violates the very idea of the kingdom of ends. Yet Kant recognizes this remains a regulative ideal, rather than an empirical possibility. We cannot fully realize the kingdom of ends in the sensible world because we are finite beings with conflicting interests, limited knowledge, and imperfect virtue. But we can work toward approximating it through just institutions, moral education, and the gradual enlightenment of humanity. This vision connects individual moral development with social and political progress in a profound way. We cannot achieve virtue in isolation from just institutions, nor can we create just institutions without virtuous individuals. The kingdom of ends thus points beyond individual morality toward questions of politics, education, and historical progress. It suggests that moral philosophy must ultimately concern itself not only with right action, but with the conditions that make moral community possible. A vision that would drive Kant's later work in political philosophy and his understanding of history as moral progress. Moral philosophy confronts a puzzle that has troubled thinkers for centuries. How can the mere recognition of duty move us to action? This question strikes at the heart of Kant's practical philosophy, revealing what he called the paradox of moral motivation. The difficulty seems insurmountable. Thoughts, after all, are just ideas floating through consciousness, abstract principles, with no apparent power to compel behavior. Action requires force, drive, some kind of motivational energy. Yet moral experience suggests something extraordinary, that we can indeed be moved by duty itself, not by any external reward or internal desire, but by the sheer recognition that something is right. The traditional solutions to this puzzle prove inadequate. If moral motivation comes from desire, even the noble desire to be good, then morality becomes what Kant calls heteronomous, governed by something other than reason itself. We become moral not because we freely choose the right, but because we happen to want it. If moral motivation comes from external compulsion, empay, fear of punishment, hope of reward, social pressure, empay, then our actions lack the freedom that genuine morality requires. We act not from autonomous choice, but from sophisticated forms of coercion. Yet, if moral motivation comes from nowhere, floating mysteriously between thought and action, it seems to violate everything we understand about human psychology. Kant's solution introduces a concept as revolutionary as it is subtle. Respect, as the unique moral feeling. Unlike every other emotion in human experience, respect is not based on sensible objects or personal interests. It emerges directly from reason's recognition of the moral law itself. When we encounter genuine duty, something remarkable occurs within consciousness. We experience what Kant describes as a complex phenomenology, a simultaneous humiliation and elevation. Our self-love, our natural inclination to prioritize our own desires and interests, feels diminished, overruled by something higher, yet our rational nature feels elevated, discovering its capacity to act on principle rather than impulse. This feeling of respect serves a dual function in moral experience. It is both the effect of recognizing moral duty and the spring of moral action. When reason apprehends the categorical imperative, respect naturally follows, not as an external addition to moral thinking, but as its inevitable emotional consequence. This respect then provides the motivational force necessary for moral action, bridging the apparent gap between abstract principle and concrete behavior. We are moved not by desire or compulsion, but by reason's own recognition of its supreme practical authority. The distinction between acting from duty and acting merely in accordance with duty reveals the stringent demands of genuine moral worth. Consider Kant's famous examples. The shopkeeper, who gives correct change from prudence, acts in accordance with duty, but derives no moral credit. His action springs from self-interest, not moral recognition. The person who helps others from natural sympathy similarly acts in accordance with duty whilst lacking moral worth. Their action flows from inclination, however admirable, rather than from duty itself. Only the person who acts because it is right, regardless of inclination, consequence, or personal benefit, acts from duty and achieves genuine moral worth. This analysis might seem to render morality cold and mechanical, draining human action of warmth and spontaneity. Yet, Kant argues precisely the opposite. Acting from duty represents the highest form of human freedom. When we act from inclination, we remain subject to the natural forces that shape our desires. When we act from social pressure, we remain subject to external determination. Only when we act from duty do we achieve genuine autonomy, insist of 2.8. The the capacity to determine our own actions through reason rather than being determined by forces beyond our control. The paradox deepens when we recognize the epistemic limitations built into moral experience. Part 6. The Postulates of Practical Reason, God, Freedom, and Immortality. Kant's moral philosophy reaches its most ambitious moment when practical reason demands not merely that we act from duty, but that we pursue the highest good, the summum bonum. This isn't simply virtue standing alone in austere isolation, but virtue crowned with proportionate happiness. Whilst virtue remains the supreme good, from nothing else can be good without qualification, except the good will, it cannot constitute the complete good that practical reason ultimately seeks. The highest good requires both moral worthiness and the happiness that such worthiness deserves. This demand emerges not from our desires but from reason itself. A world where virtue and misery coincide permanently, where the morally worthy suffer whilst the vicious prosper, would violate practical reason's fundamental requirement for systematic unity between the moral and natural orders. We're not meant to be moral in order to be happy. That would corrupt the purity of moral motivation. But rather, happiness should follow virtue as its natural consequence in a rationally ordered cosmos. Yet, virtue alone cannot satisfy practical reason's demand for completeness. If virtue were the whole of the good, then our natural human need for happiness would become morally irrelevant, effectively denying the significance of our sensible nature. We are not purely rational beings, but embodied creatures with legitimate needs and desires. If happiness alone were the good, then morality would be merely instrumental, a tool for getting what we want. The highest good transcends this false choice by requiring both elements in proper proportion. This generates what Kant calls the antinomy of practical reason, a contradiction that strikes at the heart of moral philosophy. Practical reason commands us to seek the highest good. This is not optional, but follows necessarily from the moral law. Yet this same highest good appears impossible to achieve in the natural world. There exists no necessary connection between virtue and happiness in nature. Earthquakes destroy the homes of saints and sinners alike. Disease strikes the compassionate and the cruel with equal indifference. Human cruelty and natural disaster distribute happiness and misery without the slightest regard for moral desert. If we must seek what appears impossible, practical reason seems to contradict itself. The very faculty that commands moral action appears to set us an incoherent task. This antinomy cannot be resolved by abandoning either horn of the dilemma, eine dies. We cannot give up the pursuit of the highest good without abandoning morality itself, yet we cannot ignore the manifest impossibility of achieving it in the sensible world. The resolution lies in recognizing that this contradiction drives practical reason beyond the boundaries of sensible experience. If the highest good is both commanded and impossible in nature, then practical reason must postulate conditions under which it becomes possible. These postulates, God, freedom, and immortality, are not dogmatic metaphysical claims that we can prove theoretically. Rather, they are necessary assumptions for coherent moral action, beliefs we must hold if we take morality seriously. The postulates represent practical reason's refusal to accept the ultimate incoherence of the moral project. They are not wishful thinking, but rational necessities, not because we can demonstrate their truth, but because moral action becomes meaningless without them. In this way, practical reason leads us from the phenomena of moral experience to the freedom of rational faith. Kant's moral philosophy reaches a remarkable juncture where the demands of ethical action force us beyond the boundaries of theoretical knowledge into a realm of practical necessity. The postulates of practical reason, I know freedom, immortality, and God, emerge not as metaphysical speculations, but as indispensable conditions without which moral action becomes incoherent. Freedom stands as the first and most fundamental postulate because moral obligation itself depends upon it. The principle is elegantly simple. Ought implies can. If we are entirely determined by natural causes, swept along by the mechanical necessity that governs physical events, then moral responsibility dissolves into illusion. We cannot be held accountable for actions we could not avoid, nor can we meaningfully speak of duty, where choice is impossible. Yet every moral judgment we make, every instance where we hold ourselves or others responsible, commits us to the belief that rational agents can act on principles rather than being merely determined by natural forces. This freedom need not be theoretically proven, for the first critique already demonstrated such proof to be impossible within the bounds of human knowledge. Instead, freedom must be presupposed practically whenever we engage in moral reasoning. The moment we deliberate about what we ought to do, we already assume our capacity to choose based on rational principles rather than natural impulses. The second postulate emerges from an equally compelling practical necessity. The moral law commands not merely good actions but perfect virtue, what Kant calls holiness of will. Yet finite rational beings like ourselves can only approach this ideal asymptotically through infinite progress toward moral perfection. We cannot achieve complete virtue in this life, with our limited time and persistent inclinations pulling against duty. If moral perfection is genuinely commanded but impossible within finite existence, practical reason must assume conditions under which it becomes achievable. Hence, the postulate of immortality, not as wishful thinking about personal survival, but as the rational requirement that the soul's existence extends indefinitely to allow for the infinite moral progress that duty demands. The third postulate addresses an even more complex practical requirement. The highest good, the complete object of practical reason, requires not only virtue, but happiness proportioned to virtue. Yet experience reveals no natural mechanism ensuring this connection. The virtuous often suffer whilst the vicious prosper, and natural causes operate independently of moral desert. Only an intelligent cause of the world who is also perfectly moral could guarantee that virtue and happiness ultimately coincide. Thus, practical reason postulates God's existence, any age, not as a theoretical proof of divine reality, but as a necessary assumption for rational agents committed to promoting the highest good. These postulates occupy a unique epistemological territory, distinct from both theoretical knowledge and mere opinion. We do not know that we are free, immortal, or that God exists in the way we know mathematical truths or empirical facts about nature. Such knowledge remains forever beyond human cognition. But neither are these postulates arbitrary beliefs or comforting fantasies. They represent what Kant calls practical faith, a rational belief grounded in the demands of moral reason itself. To act coherently as moral agents, we must believe these things, even though we cannot know them theoretically. This creates a profound expansion of human reason beyond its theoretical limits, not through dogmatic speculation, but through the practical necessities of moral action. The postulates reveal how moral commitment itself generates a form of rational belief that transcends the boundaries of possible experience whilst remaining grounded in reason's own demands. Rational faith emerges from Kant's critical philosophy as something entirely distinct from both theoretical knowledge and mere opinion. This is not blind faith or wishful thinking, but belief grounded in the practical necessity of moral action itself. We believe in freedom, immortality, and God not because we possess theoretical evidence for their existence, but because moral action becomes impossible without these fundamental presuppositions. Rational faith carries subjective certainty. We must hold these beliefs if we are to act as moral agents, whilst remaining objectively uncertain in theoretical terms. The moral law demands that we act as free beings capable of infinite moral progress, in a universe where virtue ultimately aligns with happiness. Yet theoretical reason cannot demonstrate any of these conditions. This reveals why practical reason claims primacy over theoretical reason in matters of ultimate human significance. Whilst theoretical reason can only think the ideas of freedom, immortality, and God as limiting concepts that prevent dogmatic materialism, practical reason provides positive grounds for believing in them. The moral law within us reveals supersensible reality that theoretical cognition can only approach negatively through what it cannot prove, rather than what it can establish. Kant's revolutionary insight shows that practical reason doesn't extend theoretical knowledge beyond its proper bounds, but opens dimensions of reality that remain forever closed to theoretical cognition alone. The moral argument for God's existence exemplifies this practical grounding of rational faith. Kant offers not a theoretical proof, but a practical argument demonstrating why belief in God becomes necessary for any rational moral agent. If we take seriously the categorical imperatives demand that we promote the highest good, the union of virtue and happiness, we must believe in conditions that make this supreme end possible. Since nature provides no guarantee that moral worth will be rewarded with proportionate happiness, we must postulate a moral author of nature capable of ensuring this essential connection. The moral argument doesn't prove God's existence in any theoretical sense, but shows why moral consciousness itself demands this belief. This rational faith makes room for belief by demonstrating that moral consciousness opens dimensions of reality closed to theoretical knowledge. The first critique limited knowledge to make room for faith. The second critique reveals what fills that room. We cannot know ourselves as free, immortal, or related to God through theoretical reason's demonstrations, but we encounter ourselves as precisely such beings through the immediate fact of moral experience. This creates an entirely new relationship between reason and faith. Not opposition, but complementarity, where faith becomes grounded in reason's practical demands rather than opposed to reason's theoretical limits. The postulates of practical reason thus represent reason's own demand for faith, showing how critical philosophy transforms our understanding of both rational belief and human dignity. Part 7. The critique of judgment, beauty, and the bridge between nature and freedom. Kant's third critique emerges from a profound systematic crisis. After establishing how understanding legislates to nature through the categories and how reason legislates to freedom through the moral law, a disturbing gap opens. We inhabit two worlds: the mechanical realm, where causal necessity reigns supreme, and the moral realm, where rational self-legislation creates the possibility of genuine freedom. These domains appear utterly disconnected. The natural world operates according to universal laws that determine every event through prior causes. The moral world demands that we act from principles we give ourselves, transcending natural determination. Without some bridge between them, human existence becomes schizophrenic. Our deepest moral aspirations have no relation to the natural world, where we must actually live and act. This gap threatens the entire critical philosophy. If nature and freedom remain forever separate, how can moral action be possible? How can we hope to realize the highest good in a world governed by mechanical laws. Kant recognizes that understanding and reason, despite their legislative authority in their respective domains, cannot solve this problem. Understanding knows only mechanical causation. Reason knows only moral legislation. Neither can establish the connection between natural necessity and moral freedom. Judgment emerges as the crucial mediating faculty. Whilst understanding thinks the particular under the universal by applying given concepts to given objects, and reason seeks the unconditioned universal that grounds all moral legislation, judgment faces a distinctive task. It must think the particular under the universal when no determinate universal is given. This happens when we encounter something beautiful and declare it so, without being able to specify rules that would make our judgment universally valid. It happens when we observe living organisms and see them as purposive wholes, without being able to reduce their organization to purely mechanical laws. Kant distinguishes between two forms of judgment that operate according to fundamentally different principles. Determinate judgment applies given universals to particulars. When we recognize a specific figure as triangular, we subsume the particular under the universal concept, triangle. The universal is already determined, and judgment simply applies it. But reflective judgment faces the reverse situation. Given particulars, it seeks universals that are not already determined. When we stand before a beautiful landscape, we seek the principle that makes our pleasure universally communicable. When we study a living organism, we seek the principle that explains its purposive organization. Reflective judgment cannot determine objects the way understanding does through its categories. It possesses no concepts that constitute objects of experience. Instead, it provides regulative principles that guide our investigation of nature and our appreciation of beauty. These principles do not tell us what objects are, but how we must think about them to make sense of certain experiences that neither pure understanding nor practical reason can adequately address. The principle that governs reflective judgment is purposiveness without purpose, one of Kant's most subtle and powerful ideas. We must judge as if nature were designed for our cognitive faculties, as if the particular laws of nature formed a systematic unity that our understanding can grasp, as if beautiful objects were made to please us. This as-if structure is crucial. We do not claim to know that nature actually has purposes or that beautiful objects were literally designed for our appreciation. We cannot prove teleological claims about nature's ultimate design, but we must think according to these principles to make sense of our experience of natural beauty, organic life, and the systematic unity of empirical laws. This principle of purposiveness allows judgment to bridge the terrifying gap between mechanism and freedom. It finds purposiveness in nature without reducing nature to mechanism or freedom to nature. Beauty presents us with one of philosophy's most perplexing puzzles. When you declare a sunset beautiful or a piece of music sublime, you make a claim that appears simultaneously personal and universal. The judgment springs from your immediate feeling rather than conceptual analysis, yet you expect, indeed demand, that others share your response. This creates a philosophical paradox that cuts to the heart of human experience. How can a judgment rooted in subjective feeling carry universal authority? Kant recognized that aesthetic judgment occupies a unique position between the objective realm of knowledge and the subjective realm of personal preference. If beauty were objective like mathematical properties, we could prove our aesthetic judgments through demonstration. If beauty were merely subjective like taste preferences, we would have no grounds for expecting others to agree. Yet aesthetic experience involves both elements, the immediacy of personal response and the conviction that this response should be shared by all rational beings. The structure of aesthetic judgment reveals this paradox through what Kant identified as four defining characteristics. First, aesthetic satisfaction must be disinterested. We must abstract from all personal stakes in the object's existence or practical function. When judging a building's beauty, we cannot consider whether we might want to live there or profit from its construction. This disinterestedness distinguishes aesthetic appreciation from mere personal preference or practical evaluation. Second, aesthetic judgment claims universal validity without relying on concepts. Unlike logical arguments that convince through rules and definitions, aesthetic judgments demand agreement based on the assumption that all humans share the same basic cognitive structure. We expect others to find beautiful what we find beautiful not because we can prove it, but because we presume they possess the same faculties of imagination and understanding, operating in the same harmonious relationship. Third, beautiful objects exhibit what Kant called purposiveness. Without purpose, they appear designed to please us, without serving any determinate function we can specify. A flower seems perfectly crafted to delight the human mind, yet we cannot identify any actual purpose this apparent design serves. This gives aesthetic objects their distinctive character of meaningful meaninglessness, significant without being reducible to conceptual content. Fourth, aesthetic satisfaction carries a sense of necessity in common. We feel that everyone ought to find this object beautiful, not merely that they happen to do so. This necessity differs from logical or practical necessity because it cannot be demonstrated or enforced, yet it remains an essential component of genuine aesthetic experience. Disinterestedness proves crucial for understanding how aesthetic judgment can claim universality without concepts. By abstracting from everything that connects the object to our personal interests, desires, or circumstances, we position ourselves to speak for humanity as such, rather than merely for ourselves. When personal stakes are eliminated, our response emerges from the pure operation of cognitive faculties that all rational beings share. The universality of aesthetic judgment thus rests not on shared rules or concepts, but on shared human nature. The same imagination and understanding, harmonizing in the same way across different individuals. This analysis reveals beauty's deeper significance as a symbol of moral goodness. Both aesthetic and moral experience involve a distinctive harmony between freedom and law, particular and universal. In aesthetic judgment, imagination and understanding harmonize freely without being constrained by determinate concepts. The imagination plays freely whilst remaining in harmony with the understanding's general requirements. In moral experience, individual will and universal law harmonize through autonomous self-legislation, SA. We freely choose principles that bind us universally. Beautiful objects thus provide sensible representations of supersensible moral ideas. The sublime shatters the comfortable harmony of aesthetic experience, where beauty presents us with a gentle play between imagination and understanding. The sublime throws us into conflict, a conflict that ultimately reveals something extraordinary about our nature as rational beings. Kant distinguishes two forms of sublime experience, each revealing different aspects of our supersensible nature. The mathematical sublime confronts us with the absolutely great magnitudes that overwhelm our imagination's capacity to comprehend them. Standing beneath a starlit sky, we attempt to grasp the universe's immensity, but our imagination fails. We cannot hold infinite space in a single mental image, cannot comprehend absolute magnitude through sensible intuition. Yet something remarkable happens in this failure. Whilst our imagination capitulates, our reason effortlessly thinks infinity. We conceive what we cannot imagine, demonstrating a capacity that transcends the natural world's limitations. The dynamical sublime operates differently, confronting us not with overwhelming magnitude, but with overwhelming power. Witnessing a violent thunderstorm from safety, we feel nature's capacity to destroy us physically. Our bodily existence appears insignificant against such forces, but this recognition of physical vulnerability simultaneously reveals moral superiority. We discover ourselves capable of judging natural power itself, of maintaining dignity in the face of forces that could annihilate us. The storm can destroy our bodies but cannot touch our moral worth. Both forms of sublime experience share a distinctive structure: initial displeasure, followed by a more profound pleasure. We first feel humiliated by our imagination's failure or our physical vulnerability, then elevated by the discovery of capacities that transcend nature. This movement from humiliation to elevation distinguishes the sublime from beauty's immediate harmony. The sublime thus provides something beauty cannot: direct access to our supersensible nature through sensible experience. Beauty remains tied to the harmonious play of cognitive faculties within the bounds of possible experience. The sublime breaks those bounds, revealing that we possess faculties. Reason's capacity to think infinity, moral feelings' independence from natural inclination, MI, that belong to a supersensible realm. This revelation carries profound implications. When we experience the sublime, we discover that we are more than merely natural beings subject to natural laws. We find ourselves capable of transcending nature's limitations through reason, of maintaining moral dignity despite physical vulnerability. The sublime thus provides a kind of sensible proof of our noumenal nature. If you feel ourselves as beings who exist in nature, but are not merely of nature, this recognition prepares us for moral experience by establishing our independence from natural determination. If we can transcend nature's limitations in aesthetic judgment, we might also transcend them in moral action. The sublime thus bridges aesthetic and moral experience, revealing the supersensible ground that makes both possible. But the sublime also points toward a deeper question about nature itself. If we can experience the sublime, if nature provides occasions for recognizing our supersensible destination, perhaps nature is structured to support this recognition. Perhaps the natural world exhibits a purposiveness that promotes our moral development. Ajar, a possibility that leads us toward teleological judgment and the question of whether nature serves moral ends. Part 8. Teleological Judgment and the Unity of Nature. Living organisms present us with a profound puzzle that mechanical explanation alone cannot resolve. Consider a tree. Its leaves exist for the sake of the whole organism, producing nutrients through photosynthesis. Whilst the tree as a whole exists through and for its parts, providing the structural support and resource distribution that enables each leaf to function. This reciprocal relationship, room, where every part serves the whole, and the whole serves each part, reveals what Kant identified as natural purpose, a form of organization fundamentally different from both human artifacts and mere mechanisms. Unlike artifacts, where purpose is imposed from outside by a designer, organisms exhibit intrinsic purposiveness. A watch's parts serve the timekeeper's intention, but a heart's function emerges from the organism's own self-organizing activity. Unlike mere mechanisms, where parts relate only through efficient causation, one billiard ball striking another, organisms display a circular causality where each element is simultaneously cause and effect of the others. The heart pumps blood because the organism needs circulation, yet the organism exists as the kind of being that needs circulation because it has a heart. This presents mechanical explanation with an insurmountable difficulty. We can describe in precise chemical detail how a heart contracts, how blood flows, how nutrients are absorbed. But these descriptions cannot explain why these processes are organized in ways that maintain and reproduce the organism. Mechanical causation works from part to whole, effects following from antecedent causes according to universal laws. Organisms, however, seem to exhibit final causation, where the whole somehow organizes and directs the parts toward ends that serve the system's continuation. We cannot explain why hearts pump blood without reference to the function this serves for the organism as a whole. Yet, this functional explanation appears to introduce a problematic teleology into nature, as if organisms were designed for their purposes. Kant's solution is characteristically subtle. We must think of organisms as if they were purposes, without claiming to know this objectively. This as-if structure, the regulative use of teleological judgment, allows us to investigate living beings systematically, whilst avoiding both mechanistic reductionism and supernatural design. Teleological judgment provides a heuristic principle for biological research. Look for functions, adaptations, systematic organization. This guides inquiry without making constitutive claims about nature's ultimate structure. We investigate organisms by asking what each part contributes to the whole's maintenance and reproduction, but we do not thereby assert that nature literally contains purposes. The distinction between intrinsic and external teleology becomes crucial here. Natural purposes exhibit self-organization. They are self-producing, self-maintaining, and self-reproducing systems. This intrinsic teleology differs fundamentally from the external teleology of artifacts, where design is imposed by an outside agent. Recognizing this distinction preserves organisms' unique status as neither mere machines nor products of conscious design, but as self-organizing systems that generate their own purposive structure through their very activity. When we attempt to understand living organisms through pure reason, we encounter a fundamental contradiction that threatens the very possibility of biological knowledge. The antinomy of teleological judgment presents us with two equally necessary, yet apparently incompatible principles. The thesis demands that all production of material things and their forms must be judged as possible according to merely mechanical laws, ESS, because genuine science requires universal mechanical causation that operates without exception. Every natural phenomenon, including the most complex organism, must ultimately reduce to the collision of particles governed by mathematical laws. Yet the antithesis insists that some products of material nature cannot be judged as possible according to merely mechanical laws, because organisms exhibit genuine purposiveness that transcends mere mechanism. The intricate organization of a flower, the self-regulating systems of animal bodies, the adaptive responses of living beings to their environment, these phenomena seem to demand teleological explanation that recognizes genuine purposes operating in nature. Both principles appear absolutely necessary for human understanding, yet they seem to contradict each other completely. If we accept pure mechanism, we must somehow explain how random mechanical processes produce the breathtaking purposiveness we observe in every living being. How do blind forces create the eye that sees, the heart that pumps blood precisely where needed, the immune system that recognizes and destroys specific threats, is less than #0, 5# is greater than? The mechanical worldview demands that all this apparent design emerges from purposeless matter in motion, yet such an explanation seems to dissolve the very phenomena we seek to understand. Conversely, if we embrace objective teleology, we anthropomorphize nature by attributing genuine intentions and conscious purposes to natural processes. We imagine that nature itself possesses the kind of rational planning we associate with human design, transforming the natural world into a cosmic intelligence pursuing predetermined goals. The attempted solutions to this antinomy reveal why it cannot be resolved through ordinary philosophical methods. Pure mechanism fails because it cannot genuinely explain organization and adaptation. It can describe the chemical reactions in a living cell, but not why these reactions form self-maintaining systems that reproduce and adapt to changing conditions. Random mechanical processes might produce complex structures, but they cannot account for the systematic unity that characterizes every organism, where each part exists for the whole, and the whole exists through the parts. Meanwhile, objective teleology fails because it abandons scientific explanation entirely, replacing causal investigation with mysterious purposes that operate through unknown means. If we abandon mechanism, we abandon the possibility of rigorous scientific knowledge. If we abandon teleology, we lose the ability to understand what makes living beings fundamentally different from mere machines. Kant's critical method resolves this antinomy by revealing that both principles are regulative rather than constitutive. Chivel. They guide our investigation without making claims about how things exist in themselves. Mechanical explanation serves as a regulative principle for understanding efficient causation throughout nature, demanding that we seek mathematical laws governing all natural processes. Teleological explanation operates as a regulative principle for understanding systematic organization in living beings, requiring us to investigate how parts relate to wholes in self-maintaining systems. We need both perspectives without claiming to know which, if either, describes the ultimate nature of reality. This resolution preserves both scientific rigor and biological understanding by recognizing the limits of human cognition. The complementarity of mechanical and teleological explanation emerges once we understand their different roles in human knowledge. They operate at different levels and serve different purposes without contradicting each other. External teleology reveals systematic relationships throughout nature. Ceph, the way rivers serve the needs of plant life, how different species maintain ecological balance, how geological processes create conditions for biological development. Internal teleology shows us something more profound. Organisms that organize themselves according to their own internal principles, where each part exists for the sake of the whole, and the whole exists through the coordination of its parts. Yet neither external nor internal teleology can provide what reflective judgment ultimately seeks: an ultimate purpose that would give meaning to natural development as a whole. Only moral teleology can provide this ultimate purpose, because only moral beings can give themselves purposes rather than merely serving purposes given by nature. A tree grows towards sunlight. A bird builds nests. A predator hunts prey. See, but in each case, the purpose is given by natural inclination or instinct. The tree cannot choose different goals for itself. The bird cannot decide that nest building is morally wrong. The predator cannot deliberate about whether hunting serves a higher good. These beings serve purposes, but they cannot set purposes through rational choice. Human beings alone possess this capacity for moral self-legislation. We are nature's ultimate purpose, not because we are its final product in some temporal sequence, but because we are the only beings who can give purpose to natural development itself. When we choose to act from duty rather than inclination, when we subordinate natural desires to moral principles, when we work toward goals that transcend immediate self-interest, we demonstrate a capacity that no other natural being possesses. We can appreciate nature's systematic unity precisely because we can step outside the causal chains that govern natural processes and evaluate them according to rational principles. This points toward culture as the development of human capacity for setting ends. Natural development creates the conditions under which moral development becomes possible, not by determining our moral choices, but by cultivating the rational capacities through which moral choice becomes actual. Culture is the bridge between natural development and moral progress. Through cultural development, we learn to subordinate natural inclinations to moral principles, to coordinate our individual purposes with universal moral laws, to work toward ends that reason sets for itself, rather than ends that nature imposes upon us. This doesn't mean nature intends moral development in some anthropomorphic sense. Nature cannot have intentions because intention requires the kind of rational self-consciousness that only emerges through natural development. Rather, natural processes create beings capable of moral choice without determining what choices we make. The ultimate purpose of nature is thus to produce beings who can transcend nature through moral self-legislation, completing the systematic unity of Kant's critical philosophy by showing how natural necessity and moral freedom connect, without reducing either to the other. We stand at the intersection where nature's development points beyond itself toward moral autonomy. Natural processes cultivate rational capacities. Moral autonomy employs those capacities to legislate universal principles that nature itself cannot provide. This preserves both the systematic unity that reflective judgment seeks and the moral freedom that practical reason demands. Nature's ultimate purpose is to create beings who can give themselves purposes, thereby completing nature's development. Part 9. What is Enlightenment? Intellectual courage and human maturity. Sapere aude. Have courage to use your own understanding. Kant's rallying cry echoes across centuries as the motto of enlightenment itself. This is not merely about acquiring knowledge or collecting facts. It is about the courage to think for oneself without guidance from external authority. The Latin phrase, borrowed from Horace, becomes in Kant's hands a revolutionary declaration. Human beings must dare to use their own reason. This courage connects directly to the critical philosophy's central mission. When Kant investigates reason's own powers and limits, he is not engaged in abstract philosophical exercise, but in the practical work of human liberation. Enlightenment is the critical philosophy in action, using reason to examine reason itself, including the social and political conditions that either support or hinder rational autonomy. The three critiques are not merely academic treatises, but weapons in humanity's struggle for intellectual freedom. Kant defines enlightenment as humanity's emergence from self-incurred tutelage, the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. The key word is self-incurred. This tutelage is not due to lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use understanding independently. Most people remain in tutelage not because they cannot think, but because thinking for oneself requires effort risk, and the willingness to take responsibility for one's beliefs and actions. This connects intellectual and moral courage in profound ways. Thinking for oneself is not just an intellectual exercise but the foundation of moral autonomy. If we let others think for us in theoretical matters, accepting religious doctrines without examination, scientific claims without understanding, philosophical positions without reasoning, we are likely to let them decide for us in practical matters as well. The courage to use one's own understanding in science, philosophy, and religion is preparation for the courage to make one's own moral decisions. Intellectual dependence and moral heteronomy go hand in hand. Yet why do most people remain in tutelage, despite their capacity for independent thought? Kant identifies the culprits. Laziness and cowardice make it comfortable to let others think for us. It's easier to follow rules than to think through principles. Easier to accept authority than to evaluate evidence. Easier to conform than to risk being wrong or unpopular. We have our book to serve as our understanding, our pastor to serve as our conscience, our physician to decide our diet. We need not think at all. But this comfort comes at the price of human dignity. We become less than fully human when we refuse to exercise our distinctive capacity for rational autonomy. The guardians who have so kindly taken supervision over us have made domestic animals of us, carefully preventing us from daring to take a single step without the leading strings to which they have tied us. Enlightenment demands we cut these strings and learn to walk on our own. Enlightenment presents us with an immediate paradox. Kant's famous motto, "Dare to know," seems to demand complete intellectual freedom. Our Jess, the courage to think for ourselves without external constraint. Yet, society requires that people fulfill their roles and responsibilities. Soldiers must obey orders, citizens must pay taxes, clergy must teach established doctrine. If everyone thinks for themselves about everything, won't society collapse into chaos? How can we promote the very intellectual freedom that Enlightenment demands, whilst maintaining the social stability that makes such freedom possible? Kant's answer lies in a subtle but crucial distinction between what he calls the private and public uses of reason. The private use of reason occurs when someone acts in a particular civil office or function, as a soldier following orders, a taxpayer fulfilling obligations, or a clergyman delivering sermons. Here, restrictions may be necessary for social coordination. The institution requires certain behaviors, and individual judgment must sometimes be suspended for the collective good. But the public use of reason occurs when that same person addresses humanity as a whole in their capacity as a scholar or rational being. Here, freedom must be unlimited. Consider Kant's example of the clergyman, in his private capacity, delivering Sunday sermons to his congregation. He must teach the established doctrine of his church. The institution has appointed him to this role, and departing from orthodox teaching would violate his professional duties. But in his public capacity, ARC, writing articles for learned journals, publishing books, engaging in scholarly debate, that same clergyman may freely criticize the very doctrines he's bound to teach. He addresses not his specific congregation, but the educated public, contributing to the broader conversation about religious truth. This distinction generates Kant's paradoxical formula: argue as much as you will, but obey. At first glance, this seems to undermine the very spirit of Enlightenment. How can genuine intellectual freedom coexist with demands for obedience? But Kant sees this as providing a path for gradual enlightenment without social chaos. People can fulfill their social roles while simultaneously subjecting those roles to rational criticism The genius of this arrangement becomes clear when we consider its long-term effects. Bad laws and irrational institutions will gradually be changed as public discussion reveals their inadequacies, but they remain in force until better alternatives are established through legitimate processes. The tax collector may privately believe certain taxes are unjust, but continues collecting them whilst publicly arguing for tax reform. The soldier may question the wisdom of particular military policies whilst maintaining discipline in the field. This creates pressure for reform without immediate disruption. The public use of reason thus protects both social order and intellectual progress. Immediate revolution would destroy the very conditions necessary for rational discussion. IPUS, the stability, education, and institutions that make enlightenment possible. But permanent acceptance of irrational authority would prevent human development entirely. Public rational discourse creates a space for gradual reform, guided by reason rather than mere force or tradition. This framework reveals enlightenment not as a sudden liberation, but as a gradual process requiring careful institutional support. The question then becomes, what conditions are necessary for the public use of reason to flourish? How do we create and maintain institutions that genuinely support this process, rather than merely paying lip service to intellectual freedom whilst suppressing genuine criticism? Kant's famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, draws a crucial distinction that shapes his entire philosophical project. The difference between living in an age of enlightenment and living in an enlightened age: we inhabit the former, not the latter. This distinction cuts to the heart of human progress and the nature of rational development itself. An age of enlightenment is a period of emergence, a time when humanity begins to shake off what Kant calls self-incurred tutelage, the comfortable dependence on others to think for us. We are witnessing the first stirrings of intellectual courage, the tentative steps toward using our own understanding without external guidance. But this is not yet an enlightened age, where such independence has become the natural condition of human life. The process is gradual, uneven, and perpetually fragile. This temporal dimension reveals something profound about human development. Enlightenment cannot be achieved once and then possessed forever. Each generation must win its intellectual freedom anew, creating conditions that allow the next generation to advance further still. The Prussian king who grants religious freedom today might be succeeded by one who revokes it tomorrow. The institutions that support free inquiry in one era may calcify into dogma in another. Education emerges as the cornerstone of this ongoing process, but not education as mere information transfer. Kant envisions education that develops critical faculties rather than just filling minds with facts. Students must learn not what to think, but how to think. How to examine evidence, question assumptions, and follow arguments wherever they lead. This pedagogical revolution requires educators who themselves possess intellectual courage, who can model the very independence they seek to cultivate. Freedom of speech becomes equally essential, not as an abstract right, but as the practical condition for what Kant calls the public use of reason. When scholars, writers, and citizens can openly debate ideas without fear of persecution, society creates the conversational space where better arguments can emerge and prevail. This freedom protects the collective thinking process that drives social progress forward. Political reform follows naturally from these intellectual developments. Enlightened citizens demand institutions that support, rather than hinder, rational autonomy. They seek laws based on reason, rather than tradition. Governments accountable to the people rather than to divine right and social arrangements that maximize human flourishing, rather than merely preserving existing power structures. Yet Kant recognizes the deep interdependence between individual and social transformation. Personal intellectual courage requires supportive institutions, MAI, libraries, universities, free presses, legal protections for dissent, but these institutions cannot function without individuals willing to use them responsibly, to think for themselves, rather than simply consume whatever information is provided. This interdependence means that promoting enlightenment demands attention to both personal development and social reform. Neither suffices alone. The most brilliant individual thinker cannot flourish in a society that punishes independent thought. The most perfectly designed institutions cannot function if populated by people who prefer the comfort of intellectual dependence. This vision connects directly to Kant's broader philosophical architecture. The courage to think for oneself represents the practical application of the critical philosophy's investigation of reason's powers and limits. When we understand what human reason can and cannot achieve, we become better equipped to use it responsibly. Part 10. Political Philosophy, From Natural State to Perpetual Peace. Kant transforms the familiar story of humanity's emergence from the state of nature into something far more subtle and morally urgent than his predecessors imagined. Where Hobbes painted the natural condition as a war of all against all, and Locke saw it as generally peaceful but inconvenient, Kant identifies the fundamental problem as legal uncertainty rather than physical insecurity or practical inconvenience. In his vision, rights exist in the state of nature because they derive from moral law itself, not from political authority. Yet this creates a profound paradox. We possess rights we cannot secure, not because we lack the power to defend them, but because we lack the moral authority to determine them. The difficulty runs deeper than mere disagreement about what rights we have. Even well-intentioned people, genuinely committed to respecting others' rights, find themselves in an impossible position. Each person must judge not only their own rights but the rights of others, and when conflicts arise, as they inevitably must, there exists no impartial authority to resolve them. We become judges in our own cases, a position that violates the very principle of justice we seek to uphold. This creates what Kant sees as a condition of legal uncertainty that wrongs others regardless of our intentions. This analysis leads Kant to a startling conclusion. Remaining in the state of nature is itself a moral wrong. The categorical imperative demands that we enter civil society, not because it serves our interests or increases our security, but because failing to do so treats others merely as means to our own judgment, rather than as ends in themselves. When we reserve the right to determine unilaterally what others owe us and what we owe them, we deny their equal capacity for rational self-determination. The duty to establish political authority emerges directly from the moral law itself. Yet Kant's social contract differs radically from the historical narratives offered by earlier thinkers. The original contract is not an event that occurred in humanity's past, but a regulative idea that guides political legitimacy in the present. Laws and institutions possess authority insofar as they could have been agreed to by rational beings in an original position of equality. This transforms the social contract from a story about origins into a standard for ongoing criticism and reform. Existing arrangements cannot claim legitimacy simply because they exist. They must demonstrate their compatibility with what free and equal rational beings would choose. This regulative function points toward republican government as the only constitution compatible with human dignity. Republican government requires the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers to prevent any person or group from becoming judge in their own case. Through this separation, political authority institutionalizes the impartiality that was structurally impossible in the state of nature. Citizens become co-legislators rather than mere subjects, participating in the creation of laws that bind them whilst respecting the equal capacity of others to do likewise. Kant's republicanism need not be democratic in the modern sense. What matters is not that everyone votes, but that political power is structured to respect everyone's rational autonomy. The separation of powers creates conditions under which rights can be both determined and enforced impartially, resolving the fundamental problem that made the state of nature morally intolerable. Through republican institutions, we escape the position of being judges in our own cases, whilst enabling others to escape it as well. Political authority presents a fundamental paradox that strikes at the heart of human freedom. How can forcing someone to act, the essence of coercion, be compatible with respecting their dignity and autonomy? This puzzle seems intractable. Coercion appears to violate freedom by definition, yet any political authority necessarily involves compelling people to follow laws, pay taxes, and submit to collective decisions. If we cannot justify coercion, then government becomes impossible, and we remain trapped in what Kant calls the state of nature. If we justify it too easily, then we undermine the very freedom that government exists to protect. Kant's solution begins with a precise understanding of what he calls right, Recht in German. Right is the sum of conditions under which the choice of one can be united with the choice of another in accordance with a universal law of freedom. This definition reveals something crucial. Right concerns external freedom, not internal morality. Unlike the moral law, which demands that we act from duty and governs our inner motivations, right focuses purely on the external conditions that allow individual freedom to coexist with universal freedom according to law. This distinction transforms how we understand legitimate coercion. When someone's action violates the universal law of freedom, when they prevent others from exercising their legitimate freedom, then coercing them to stop actually promotes freedom rather than restricting it. Legitimate coercion becomes what Kant calls a hindering of a hindrance to freedom. The person who steals violates another's property rights, creating a hindrance to that person's freedom. Stopping the thief through legal coercion removes this hindrance, thereby promoting the very conditions that make freedom possible for all. This insight reveals why political institutions cannot simply appeal to moral goodness. Kant quotes the memorable proverb, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made." Political institutions must account for human imperfection, creating incentives and constraints that channel self-interest toward public good without assuming people will always act from moral duty. This doesn't mean abandoning moral ideals, but recognizing that institutions must work with human nature as it is, whilst promoting human development toward what it could become. This realism about human nature extends beyond individual states to the relations between nations. Just as individuals require civil institutions to escape the state of nature, states themselves exist in a kind of international state of nature, where conflicts arise and no higher authority exists to resolve them. The same logic that justifies coercion within states points toward the necessity of international institutions capable of managing conflicts between states, institutions that can promote peace not by making nations moral, but by creating conditions where their self-interest aligns with peaceful cooperation. War stands as the greatest enemy of human moral development. Every conflict destroys the very conditions necessary for cultivating our rational capacities, diverting resources from education, art, and culture toward instruments of destruction. Where cannons roar, enlightenment falls silent. War promotes precisely those attitudes that morality seeks to overcome: hatred, deception, violence, whilst creating circumstances where mere survival trumps rational reflection. If humanity is to realize its moral potential, Kant argued, we must discover ways to resolve our conflicts without bloodshed. This insight led Kant to his most ambitious political project, outlining the conditions for perpetual peace. His solution rests on 3 definitive articles, each addressing a different sphere of political life. First, every state must adopt a republican constitution, MMA, one that separates powers and treats citizens as co-legislators rather than subjects. This isn't mere democracy, which Kant viewed as potentially despotic, but representative government, where the people participate in making the laws that bind them. Second, international law must be founded on a federation of free states, not world government, which would inevitably become tyrannical, but voluntary association of republics that agree to resolve disputes through law rather than force. Third, cosmopolitan law must be limited to universal hospitality, NAG, the right of every person to visit foreign countries and be treated as a potential friend rather than an enemy. These articles connect through a profound insight about republican government and peace. Republics wage war far less frequently than other forms of government because citizens bear its costs directly. When the people who must fight and pay for wars also decide whether to wage them, they choose peace. In non-republican states, rulers can declare war without personal cost. Their subjects bear the burden whilst they reap potential benefits. This represents an early version of what we now call democratic peace theory. Democracies rarely fight each other because their citizens have strong incentives for peaceful conflict resolution. Yet Kant's vision extends beyond mere non-aggression. Between republics, cosmopolitan right represents the completion of political development, NZ, the gradual creation of conditions where universal moral community becomes politically possible. As trade, communication, and cultural exchange increase, peoples become more interdependent and more conscious of their shared humanity. This doesn't eliminate conflicts, but it creates powerful incentives for peaceful resolution and gradual development of international law. Universal hospitality thus serves as the bridge between the moral insight that all rational beings belong to a single kingdom of ends and its political realization in a world federation of republics. Through this cosmopolitan development, the same rational nature that gives us moral autonomy finally achieves its political expression, transforming the earth from a battlefield into a community of nations bound by law rather than force. Part 11. Religion within the bounds of reason, moral faith, and radical evil. Kant's most unsettling insight concerns the darkness that lies at the very root of human moral life. We are not simply creatures who occasionally fail to do what is right. We are beings with a fundamental propensity to subordinate moral duty to self-love whenever it suits our purposes. This is what Kant calls radical evil, not the corruption of reason itself, which would make moral responsibility impossible, but the systematic inversion of the proper moral order within us. The evil is not that we reject morality outright. We recognize moral duty clearly enough. We understand what justice demands, what compassion requires, what honesty entails. The corruption runs deeper than ignorance or confusion. We have a tendency to make exceptions for ourselves when duty conflicts with what we want. We don't dismiss the moral law, Gena. We simply place it second when it becomes inconvenient. This propensity affects every human being without exception and cannot be eliminated through education, social reform, or natural development alone. Kant calls this evil radical because it affects the radix, the root, of all our maxims, those fundamental principles that guide our choices. The problem is not particular bad actions, but the underlying tendency to adopt maxims that consistently put self-love before moral duty. This makes radical evil more serious than any particular vice, because it corrupts the very foundation from which all our moral choices spring. A person might avoid theft, murder, and dishonesty, yet still be infected with radical evil if their fundamental maxim subordinates duty to self-interest as a matter of principle. Yet, we remain fully responsible for this propensity. Radical evil results from intelligible choice rather than natural necessity or external compulsion. We are not born evil in the sense of being naturally determined to vice. That would make moral responsibility meaningless. Instead, we freely adopt maxims that place inclination above duty. And what we have chosen through freedom, we can choose differently. Kant identifies 3 degrees of this corruption in human nature. Frailty represents weakness of will. We know what is right, but lack the strength to do it consistently. Impurity involves mixed motives. We do the right thing, but contaminate it with self-interested reasons. Depravity is the most serious. The conscious, deliberate subordination of moral duty to self-interest as a matter of principle. All 3 degrees involve the same fundamental problem: the failure to give moral incentives their proper priority over self-love. Even our best actions remain tainted. The person who helps others might be motivated partly by genuine compassion, but also by the pleasure of being seen as virtuous, the satisfaction of moral superiority, or the hope of future reciprocity. The honest merchant might tell the truth, partly from duty, but also because dishonesty would damage his reputation and profits. These mixed motives don't necessarily make the actions wrong, but they reveal how thoroughly self-love infiltrates even our moral behavior. This diagnosis creates a profound problem. If we have a propensity to evil that affects the root of all our maxims, how can genuine moral transformation be possible? Natural development cannot overcome what is chosen through intelligible freedom. Education and social reform, however valuable, cannot touch the fundamental corruption of our moral foundations. Yet, because radical evil stems from free choice rather than natural necessity, moral transformation remains possible and necessary, because we cannot overcome this propensity through natural means alone, possible, because what we have freely chosen, we can choose differently through the same freedom that created the problem. Kant's analysis of moral transformation reveals perhaps the most radical claim in his entire practical philosophy. Genuine moral change requires nothing less than a complete revolution in the supreme ground of all our maxims. This is not the gradual improvement that moral education typically promises, nor the incremental development of virtuous habits that Aristotelian ethics envisions. Instead, Kant argues that authentic moral transformation demands a fundamental reorientation of the will itself, a sudden, complete shift from self-love as our highest principle to the moral law as our unconditional priority. This revolution in the mode of thought represents what Kant calls a new birth, a transformation so fundamental that it establishes an entirely new foundation for all our subsequent choices. The person who undergoes this transformation has not simply acquired new moral knowledge or strengthened existing virtuous dispositions. They have changed the very principle by which they determine what counts as a reason for action. Where previously self-interest, inclination, or prudential calculation might have served as the ultimate arbiter of choice, now moral duty alone occupies this supreme position. Every maxim, every decision, every action must now answer first to the question of moral rightness, regardless of personal cost or benefit. The necessity of this transformation follows directly from Kant's principle that ought implies can. If the moral law commands us to be holy, to act always and only from duty, then holiness must be achievable, even if not within the confines of our earthly existence. The possibility of moral regeneration becomes a postulate of practical reason, something we must believe if we are to take moral obligations seriously. This doesn't render transformation easy or suggest we can achieve it through willpower alone. Rather, it establishes that moral transformation must be possible if moral obligation is to be more than a cruel deception. Yet this creates a profound paradox. If we possess a propensity to evil that colors all our choices, how can we choose to overcome it? The very capacity for moral transformation seems to require resources beyond our corrupted will. Here, Kant introduces the concept of grace, not as a theological doctrine, but as a morally necessary postulate. Grace represents divine assistance that enables moral transformation without violating human autonomy. We cannot understand theoretically how such assistance operates, but we must believe practically that it is available if moral transformation is to be possible at all. The relationship between the sudden revolution in principles and gradual reform in conduct reveals the complexity of moral transformation. The change of heart establishes new fundamental maxims instantaneously and completely, but implementing these maxims in particular circumstances requires ongoing effort and development. A person may be genuinely converted to moral principles while still struggling with specific temptations and failures. The revolution provides the foundation for reform, but reform itself becomes the lifelong work of implementing revolutionary principles in the concrete details of moral life. This transformation of heart thus represents both the most hopeful and most demanding aspect of Kant's moral philosophy. Hopeful because it suggests that even the most corrupted will can be renewed, demanding because it requires nothing less than the complete reconstruction of our moral identity. Individual moral effort, however sincere, confronts an insurmountable obstacle. Even when we achieve genuine moral transformation in our own hearts, we remain embedded within social structures that systematically promote vice. The marketplace rewards cunning over honesty. Political systems encourage manipulation over principle, and social hierarchies foster envy and resentment. Competition breeds the very evils that moral individuals struggle to overcome within themselves. We cannot simply retreat into private virtue, whilst the world around us continues to generate the conditions that corrupt human nature. Kant recognized that moral progress demands more than individual conversion. 4. It requires social transformation. The sources of radical evil are not merely personal but structural, woven into the fabric of human social life itself. When individuals compete for scarce resources, when success depends upon outdoing others, when social recognition flows to those who excel at others' expense, the very organization of society promotes the subordination of moral principles to self-love. No amount of individual moral effort can overcome these systematic pressures alone. This realization leads Kant to envision what he calls the invisible church, an ideal ethical community that transcends all particular religious institutions. Unlike political communities united by legal coercion or cultural communities bound by shared traditions, the invisible church would unite humanity through moral commitment alone. Its members would recognize each other not through external signs, but through their dedication to moral principles. This represents the kingdom of ends in religious form, a universal community where every member treats all others as ends in themselves, where moral law rather than statutory regulation governs human relationships. The invisible church embodies perfect moral community. Here, individual moral development and social progress align rather than conflict. Members support each other's moral growth, creating conditions that foster virtue rather than vice. Competition gives way to cooperation. Envy transforms into mutual encouragement, and the pressure to succeed at others' expense dissolves into shared commitment to moral excellence. This ideal guides our understanding of what religious institutions should become. Yet ideals require concrete approximations in the actual world. The visible church. Particular religious institutions, with their specific doctrines, rituals, and authorities, serves as humanity's necessary attempt to realize ethical community under historical conditions. These institutions provide tangible ways for people to work together for moral improvement, offering shared practices, mutual support, and organized efforts to promote virtue. The visible church becomes legitimate precisely insofar as it serves these moral purposes rather than mere ritual observance. Kant insists that historical faith, fa, commitment to particular religious traditions, should serve moral faith rather than replacing it. The value of specific doctrines, ceremonies, and religious authorities lies in their capacity to promote genuine moral development. When religious institutions encourage moral autonomy, support individual conscience, and work toward universal moral community, they fulfill their proper function. When they demand heteronomous obedience, suppress moral reasoning, or promote sectarian division, they betray their essential purpose. This establishes the proper relationship between religious institutions and moral ends. Churches should promote virtue rather than mere ritual observance, encourage believers to think for themselves about moral questions rather than simply following authority, and work toward universal moral community, rather than defending narrow sectarian interests. This doesn't eliminate the value of particular religious traditions, but subordinates them to moral purposes. Part 12. The Architectonic of Pure Reason, System and Unity. Human reason is not a passive mirror of reality, but an active power driven by its own internal necessities. Kant discovered that this power organizes itself around three fundamental questions that encompass the entirety of human philosophical inquiry. What can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope? These are not arbitrary divisions imposed upon philosophy from without, but arise from reason's own structure and deepest interests. They represent the complete map of rational human activity. The first question, what can I know, drives all theoretical philosophy. It encompasses epistemology, metaphysics, and the philosophy of science. Here, reason seeks to understand the conditions and limits of possible experience, to determine what objects can be given to us and how we can have legitimate knowledge of them. The second question, what ought I to do, drives practical philosophy in all its forms. Ethics, political philosophy, and the practical aspects of religion. Here, reason reveals itself not as a knowing faculty, but as a source of unconditional moral commands. The third question, what may I hope, drives philosophy of history, religion, and human destiny. Here, reason seeks to understand whether the moral demands it places upon us can find fulfillment in the world. These three questions are systematically connected rather than independent. The limits that theoretical reason discovers about human knowledge create the very space that practical reason requires for moral action. We cannot know God, freedom, and immortality through theoretical cognition. They lie beyond the boundaries of possible experience. Yet we must believe in them practically if we are to act coherently as moral agents. The critique of theoretical reason prepares the ground for practical reason by showing what cannot be known, whilst practical reason gives positive content to ideas that theoretical reason can only think negatively. This progression is necessary, rather than contingent. Theoretical reason must first establish the conditions and limits of possible experience before practical reason can reveal our supersensible nature as moral agents. Both theoretical and practical reason must complete their work before judgment can mediate between the natural world of causality and the moral world of freedom. Each stage builds upon the previous, whilst opening entirely new dimensions of human experience. The movement reflects reason's own development from its most basic cognitive operations to its highest moral and aesthetic aspirations. Together, these three interests constitute reason's complete self-examination. Philosophy for Kant is not merely the study of external objects, but reason's systematic investigation of its own nature, powers, and limits. The three questions map the complete territory of human rational activity. Knowing, acting, and hoping represent the fundamental modes through which reason engages with reality. Understanding how reason operates in each domain reveals both its underlying unity and its remarkable complexity. The same rational capacity operates across all three spheres, yet each requires different principles and methods appropriate to its particular domain. Kant insists that philosophy must possess architectonic structure because reason itself demands systematic unity rather than mere aggregate collection of insights. Philosophy cannot be assembled from random observations or interesting discoveries, however brilliant they might appear in isolation. The Architectonic reveals how all parts of the critical philosophy fit together in a necessary structure where each element occupies its proper place and serves its essential function. Without this systematic organization, philosophy degenerates into what Kant calls rhapsody, a collection of fascinating ideas that lack coherent structure and fail to address the fundamental questions of human existence with the thoroughness they demand. This architectural necessity drives the progression from theoretical through practical to aesthetic and teleological judgment as necessary stages in the complete system. Theoretical reason establishes the conditions of possible experience, whilst simultaneously revealing the strict limits of human knowledge. It shows us what we can know with certainty, whilst demonstrating that the most important questions about freedom, God, and immortality lie beyond the boundaries of theoretical determination. Practical reason then reveals our supersensible nature through moral experience, establishing that we are indeed free rational beings capable of acting according to principles we give ourselves. Yet, practical reason alone cannot show how our moral vocation relates to the natural world in which we must act. Aesthetic judgment reveals that nature can be experienced as purposive for our cognitive faculties, suggesting a deeper harmony between our rational nature and the world we inhabit. When we experience beauty, we discover that nature seems designed to please our faculties of understanding and imagination, creating a sense of purposiveness without determinate purpose. Teleological judgment extends this discovery by revealing how natural development itself appears to support moral progress, suggesting that nature's own processes tend toward the realization of rational purposes. Each critique both limits and extends the results of the others in ways that create the systematic unity Kant seeks. The first critique limits knowledge to phenomena, making room for practical faith by showing that theoretical reason cannot disprove freedom, God, or immortality. This limitation enables the second critique to establish practical certainty about these same ideas through moral experience rather than theoretical proof. The second critique reveals our supersensible nature as rational agents, but it cannot bridge the apparent gulf between the natural world, governed by causal necessity, and the moral world governed by freedom. The third critique accomplishes this bridging through judgment's unique capacity to find purposiveness in nature, without determining specific purposes. Aesthetic judgment shows that nature appears designed to harmonize with our cognitive faculties, whilst teleological judgment suggests that natural processes themselves tend toward the development of rational beings capable of moral action. Each critique solves problems created by the others, while simultaneously creating new problems that require further investigation, generating the systematic progression that constitutes the complete. Judgment occupies this mediating role because it cannot determine objects like understanding or establish practical principles like reason, yet it can discover purposiveness that makes the moral life seem possible rather than futile. We are not aliens in the natural world, struggling to impose rational purposes on a fundamentally hostile environment. Rather, judgment reveals that nature itself supports our development as rational moral agents, creating the systematic unity between theoretical and practical philosophy that reason demands. Kant discovered something remarkable in the depths of human consciousness, a single point from which all rational activity springs. He called it the transcendental unity of apperception, ever-see, the I think that must be able to accompany all our representations. This isn't merely another philosophical principle. It's the highest point from which the entire critical philosophy hangs suspended, the keystone that holds together our understanding of knowledge, morality, and beauty. Consider what this means. Every time you recognize an object, follow a moral principle, or appreciate something beautiful, the same fundamental capacity is at work. The spontaneous activity of reason, synthesizing multiplicity into unity. When you see a tree, your understanding doesn't passively receive sensations, but actively combines them into the unified representation, tree. When you act morally, practical reason doesn't merely follow impulses, but synthesizes your maxims according to universal principles. When you find something beautiful, aesthetic judgment doesn't simply register pleasure, but harmonizes imagination and understanding in free play. These appear to be entirely different activities, yet they share a common root in the synthesizing power of rational consciousness. This insight transforms our understanding of what philosophy itself accomplishes. The critical philosophy isn't primarily about objects in the world, but about the conditions under which reason encounters those objects, makes moral choices, and appreciates beauty. Philosophy becomes reason's systematic investigation of its own nature, a kind of rational self-knowledge that reveals both our powers and our limits. Kant realized that before we can ask what we can know about the world, we must ask what it means for rational beings like ourselves to know anything at all. The self-consciousness that accompanies all our representations isn't a psychological fact, but a transcendental condition. It's what makes experience possible in the first place. Without this unifying, I think, we would have no coherent experience, no moral agency, no aesthetic appreciation, just a chaotic manifold of sensations and impulses. The unity of consciousness is what transforms mere happenings into experience, mere behavior into moral action, mere sensation into aesthetic judgment. This discovery leads to philosophy's most paradoxical achievement. The critical philosophy is simultaneously the most limiting and the most liberating of philosophical systems. It limits knowledge to make room for faith, constrains theoretical reason to make space for practical reason, demolishes dogmatic metaphysics to establish critical philosophy. Yet these limitations prove liberating rather than restrictive. By understanding what we cannot know, things in themselves, the soul as substance, God as an object of theoretical knowledge, we better understand what we genuinely can know. By recognizing the limits of theoretical reason, we discover the vast scope of practical reason and aesthetic judgment. The critical philosophy thus completes the Enlightenment project in an unexpected way. Rather than extending reason's dominion indefinitely, it reveals reason's proper sphere and genuine dignity. We cannot know everything, but within the boundaries of possible experience, our knowledge achieves genuine objectivity. We cannot prove God's existence theoretically, but practical reason gives us moral certainty of our freedom, immortality, and God's existence as postulates of moral action. We cannot demonstrate beauty's objective reality, but aesthetic judgment reveals our capacity for disinterested appreciation that connects us to others and to nature. This is philosophy's ultimate standpoint. Reason, achieving self-knowledge, understanding its own architecture, recognizing both its power and its proper limits. From this highest point, we can see how theoretical, practical, and aesthetic reason form a systematic unity, different expressions of the same spontaneous rational activity that synthesizes multiplicity into meaningful wholes. Part 13. The Legacy of Critical Philosophy, Kant's Revolution, and its Consequences. Kant's Copernican revolution extends far beyond the theoretical sphere of knowledge into every dimension of human rational activity. Just as objects must conform to the mind's cognitive structure in knowledge, maxims must conform to the moral law in ethics, and nature must be judged as purposive in aesthetic and teleological experience. The revolution transforms our understanding not merely of how we know, but of how we act, appreciate beauty, and comprehend our place in the natural order. In each domain, theoretical, practical, and aesthetic, reason displays its active, spontaneous character, shaping experience rather than passively receiving it from an external world. This systematic transformation reveals the true scope of Kant's achievement. Where traditional philosophy assumed that reason must conform to objects, Kant demonstrates that objects conform to reason's own structures. Where traditional ethics sought moral laws in nature or divine command, Kant locates them in reason's autonomous self-legislation. Where traditional aesthetics grounded beauty in objective properties, Kant discovers it in the harmonious play of our cognitive faculties. The revolution is complete because it encompasses the totality of human rational experience. The transformation extends to metaphysics itself, which undergoes a fundamental redefinition. Instead of dogmatic system building that claims knowledge of ultimate reality, critical philosophy investigates the conditions under which knowledge, moral action, and aesthetic judgment become possible for beings constituted like ourselves. This doesn't eliminate metaphysics, but transforms it from speculation about things in themselves to rigorous analysis of human reason's necessary operations. Metaphysics becomes anthropology in the transcendental sense. ca. The systematic study of what it means to be a rational, finite being. This new metaphysics abandons the pretension to know supersensible objects whilst establishing something more profound: the architecture of human rationality itself. Rather than constructing systems about God, freedom, and immortality, critical philosophy demonstrates how these ideas necessarily arise from reason's own structure and serve indispensable regulative functions in human experience. The metaphysical impulse is preserved but disciplined, channeled into understanding reason's own procedures, rather than transcending experience altogether. Kant's revolution proves more radical than Copernicus's astronomical discovery. Copernicus changed our view of the solar system, relocating Earth from the center to a planetary orbit around the Sun. But Kant transforms our understanding of the relationship between mind and world across all dimensions of experience. The Copernican revolution in astronomy was a discovery about the external world. Kant's Copernican revolution is a discovery about the nature of human reason itself. It affects not merely our cosmological position, but our comprehension of knowledge, morality, beauty, and human dignity. This philosophical revolution generates an entirely new image of human beings within the cosmic order. We emerge as neither purely natural beings, determined by causal necessity, nor purely rational beings like God, who would require no sensible experience for knowledge. Instead, we are finite rational beings who actively structure, experience, whilst remaining limited by the conditions of sensibility. This unique position makes us the only beings who belong simultaneously to both the natural and supersensible worlds, subject to natural causation as phenomena, but capable of moral freedom as noumena. The completed Copernican revolution thus reveals human dignity in a new light. We are not dignified because we occupy a privileged position in the natural order, but because we are the legislators of experience itself. Through our cognitive faculties, we constitute the natural world as an object of possible experience. Through our moral autonomy, we legislate universal laws that bind all rational beings. Kant's critical philosophy transforms our understanding of human dignity by grounding it neither in divine creation nor natural superiority, but in our unique capacity for autonomous rational self-legislation. We possess dignity precisely because we can act according to principles we give ourselves, rather than being determined by external forces, whether natural impulses, social pressures, or divine commands. This autonomy makes us ends in ourselves, never merely means to be used by others or even by our own desires. This foundation proves both more secure and more demanding than traditional accounts. Our dignity no longer depends on religious belief or metaphysical speculation about human nature's special place in creation. Instead, it rests on something we can directly experience: our ability to ask whether our actions conform to principles we could will as universal laws. Yet this very capacity creates an obligation to live up to our rational nature, to treat ourselves and others as the autonomous agents we are capable of becoming. The possibility of such moral freedom emerges directly from the critical philosophy's theoretical limitations. We can be genuinely free agents precisely because we cannot know ourselves completely as natural beings subject to causal determination. The phenomena, noumena distinction, that restricts theoretical knowledge to appearances, opens essential space for practical freedom. If we could achieve complete scientific knowledge of ourselves as things in themselves, moral responsibility would vanish. Every action would be the inevitable result of prior natural causes. Because we cannot penetrate beyond appearances to know our noumenal nature, the possibility remains that we act from moral principles rather than natural necessity. This ignorance becomes liberation. When we act from duty rather than inclination, we express our supersensible nature as rational agents. Even though we can never theoretically prove this freedom exists, the development of human rational capacities unfolds through regulative ideas that guide both individual moral progress and collective social advancement. The highest good envisions virtue crowned with happiness, not as an achievable state, but as the proper object of moral hope that sustains effort across generations. Perpetual peace represents the political realization of moral principles in international relations, whilst the ethical community embodies the social realization of the kingdom of ends in human associations. These ideas cannot be fully realized in experience, yet provide essential direction for human endeavor. They reveal that moral development and social progress intertwine necessarily. Personal autonomy requires supportive institutions that respect human dignity, whilst good institutions depend on individuals committed to moral principles rather than mere self-interest. Culture and morality develop together through this dynamic relationship. The cultivation of human rational capacities through art, science, and social institutions creates conditions for moral progress by expanding our ability to think for ourselves and consider universal principles. Simultaneously, moral progress creates better conditions for cultural development by establishing relationships based on mutual respect rather than domination or manipulation. This makes human destiny both individual and collective. C. The gradual realization of rational autonomy in personal character and social life. We cannot achieve virtue in isolation from just institutions, nor can we create just institutions without individuals capable of moral commitment. The critical philosophy thus reveals human freedom not as an abstract metaphysical doctrine, but as a practical task demanding both personal transformation and social reform across the whole span of human history. Kant's philosophical architecture remains startlingly vital in our contemporary moment. In an age of artificial intelligence that challenges our understanding of consciousness, genetic engineering that tests the boundaries of human nature, and global crises that demand unprecedented moral coordination, his systematic framework for understanding knowledge, freedom, and human dignity illuminates precisely the questions we face. The relationship between scientific progress and moral responsibility that concerned Kant has only intensified. When we debate the ethics of algorithmic decision-making or genetic modification, we confront the same fundamental tension he identified. How do we preserve human autonomy and dignity whilst acknowledging our place within natural causation? His insights about the limits of knowledge prove equally relevant. The temptation to extend scientific methods beyond their proper domain, ABA, to reduce consciousness to neural activity or morality to evolutionary advantage, exemplifies the very metaphysical overreach Kant diagnosed. Critical philosophy's insistence that reason must understand its own boundaries becomes essential when technological power outpaces moral wisdom. The categorical imperatives demand that we treat humanity never merely as means, provides crucial guidance when human beings risk becoming mere data points or genetic material for manipulation. Kant's vision of enlightenment as an ongoing process rather than completed achievement speaks directly to contemporary challenges. Each generation must develop its critical faculties, create institutions supporting rational autonomy, and work toward greater justice. The process never concludes because finite rational beings must continually realize their potential within changing circumstances. Education systems must cultivate independent thinking, not mere technical competence. Political institutions must enable genuine democratic participation, not manipulated consent. Cultural development must encourage moral growth, not simply economic advancement. This vision remains fundamentally optimistic, despite acknowledging human limitations. Reason's demands point toward genuine progress, even when perfection proves impossible. The moral law commands us to work toward the highest good. Perpetual peace guides political development. Enlightenment directs educational efforts. These regulative ideas provide hope and direction when complete success remains elusive. Human limitations make progress difficult, but never impossible. Kant's famous conclusion captures this perfectly. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing wonder and awe. The more often and steadily we reflect upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. These represent the twin aspects of human existence that critical philosophy seeks to understand: our place in the natural order and our capacity for moral autonomy. The starry heavens remind us of our finitude and dependence within vast cosmic forces beyond our control. The moral law reveals our dignity and freedom as rational agents capable of acting from duty rather than mere inclination. Together they capture the human condition as Kant understood it. Finite, rational beings, capable of knowledge, moral action, and hope for progress. We are neither gods nor beasts, but something uniquely positioned between necessity and freedom. This positioning creates both our greatest challenges and our highest possibilities. Critical philosophy provides the tools for navigating this condition with wisdom rather than illusion, responsibility rather than despair. Part 14. Conclusion. The three critiques stand together as the most systematic exploration of human reason ever undertaken. Kant recognized that rational activity operates across distinct domains: theoretical knowledge, moral action, and aesthetic judgment, each governed by its own principles, yet contributing to our unified rational nature. The first critique maps the territory of what we can know, revealing both the power and limits of theoretical reason. The second critique explores what we ought to do, establishing the autonomy of practical reason and the reality of moral obligation. The third critique examines what we may hope, showing how aesthetic experience and teleological thinking connect the sensible and supersensible worlds. These are not separate investigations but facets of one comprehensive examination. The architecture of human reason itself. This systematic unity reveals Kant's revolutionary transformation of philosophy. From dogmatic speculation to critical self-examination. Rather than claiming to penetrate ultimate reality, philosophy becomes reason's rigorous investigation of its own nature and operations. The critical method asks not whether our concepts correspond to things in themselves, but how our rational faculties make experience possible in the first place. This approach makes philosophy both more humble and more significant. Humble because it acknowledges the limits of human knowledge, significant because it reveals the conditions that make knowledge, morality, and aesthetic experience possible at all. The transformation runs deeper than methodology. Kant discovered that acknowledging reason's limits actually reveals rather than diminishes human dignity. By showing what we cannot know about the noumenal realm, he made room for moral faith and practical hope. By limiting theoretical reason's reach, he revealed the autonomous scope of practical reason. By demonstrating our finitude, he established our freedom. The very constraints that make us less than divine make us more than merely natural. This vision places moral autonomy at the heart of human dignity. We are finite, rational agents, capable of knowledge within limits. Moral action through self-legislation and aesthetic appreciation of nature's apparent purposiveness. Our dignity stems not from external authority or natural superiority, but from our capacity to act on principles we give ourselves. The categorical imperative expresses this autonomy. Every rational being possesses inherent worth as an end in themselves, regardless of their particular talents, achievements, or circumstances. The methodical professor who rarely left Königsberg understood that the greatest philosophical revolution could emerge from the most careful attention to human reason's actual operations. His insight was profound. Taking seriously both our limitations and our dignity reveals possibilities invisible to dogmatic rationalism and empirical skepticism alike. The critical philosophy offers tools for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate uses of reason in any domain, providing a foundation for enlightened progress without naive optimism. Kant's vision of autonomous, morally committed human beings working toward perpetual peace and the highest good remains our best hope for progress in an uncertain world. The revolution that began in that small study continues wherever people have the courage to think for themselves, act on moral principle, and recognize the dignity inherent in rational nature itself.